Degree Course 3rd Year. 6th Semester Paper, 13. Post-colonial Literature in English 2, Canadian Literature. Syllabus. E. Unit 1. Poetry. First Neighbours, P.K. Page. Indian Reservation. Caughnawaga, A.M. Klein. The Cattle Thief, Emily Pauline Johnson. Like an Old Proud King in a Parable, A.J.M. Smith. Unit 2. Prose and Fiction. Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, Thomas King. Disunity as Unity, A Canadian Strategy, Robert Krotesch. The Edible Woman, Margaret Atwood. Unit 3. Drama. The Ecstasy of Rita George Ryga. Unit 4. Short Stories and Legends. Face, Alice Munro. The Hostelry of Mr. Smith, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, Stephen Leacock. Cannibal Woman, Ron Geyshick. IV. Unit 5. Autobiography, Autoethnography. In Search of April Raintree, Beatrice Mosonier Culleton. Prescribed Texts. History of Canadian Literature, W. H. New. Canadian Culture. An Introductory Reader, ed. Elspeth Cameron. An Anthology of Commonwealth Poetry, ed. C. D. Narasimha. New Contexts of Canadian Criticism, Eda J. Hebel, Donna Palmatier Penny and J. R. Struthers. An Anthology of Canadian Native Literature, ed. Daniel David Moses and Terry Goldie II. Edition. Websites. Canadian Encyclopedia, www.thecanadianencyclopedia.com. Canadian Culture, www.culturecanada.gc.ca. BA, Degree Course 3rd Year, 6th Semester. Paper, 13. Post-colonial Literature in English 2, Canadian Literature. Scheme of Lessons. SL, No. Title page. 1 Introduction to Canadian Literature 001. 2 First Neighbours, P.K. Page 008. 3 Indian Reservation. Caughnawaga, A.M. Klein 011. 4 The Cattle Thief, Emily Pauline Johnson 015. 5 Like an Old Proud King in a Parable, by A.J.M. Smith 019. 6 Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, Thomas King 024. 7 Disunity as Unity, A Canadian Strategy, Robert Krotesch 029. 8 The Edible Woman, Margaret Atwood 034. 9 The Ecstasy of Rita Introduction and Short Summary 040. 10 The Ecstasy of Rita Act 1043. 11 The Ecstasy of Rita Act 2049. 12 The Ecstasy of Rita Characters and Themes 054. 13 Face by Alice Munro 059. 14 The Hostelry of Mr. Smith, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, Stephen Leacock 064. 15 Cannibal Woman, Ron Geyshick 068. 16 In Search of April Raintree, Beatrice Mosonier Culleton 071. V. 1. Lesson 1. Introduction to Canadian Literature. Learning Outcome. From this lesson you will learn: what are the historical events that shaped Canada? How they used space. How Canadian literature evolved. Who were the early writers of Canadian literature? Which were the earliest documents written? About the writers of the modern period. Features of Canadian writing. Structure. 1.1 Introduction. 1.2 Language. 1.3 Urbanism and the use of space. 1.4 Canadian literature. 1.5 The first writers, prose and poetry from settlement to 1900. 1.6 The earliest documents. 1.7 The first literary journal. 1.8 Modern period, 1900 to 60 poetry. 1.9 Modern period, 1900 to 60 novels. 1.10 Features of Canadian writing. 2. 1.11 During the 1980s and 90s. 1.12 Check your progress. 1.1. Introduction. Canada is the second largest country in the world, covering a total area of about 6.2 million square miles. It consists of 10 provinces and 3 territories. Canada shares the world's longest land border with the United States. The country derives its name from Iroquoian word Kanata, which means village. Canada is a multicultural nation that is ethnically diverse. Today, the country has a population of about 35 million, a significant number of whom are immigrants originating from different corners of the planet. Canada, just like any other country, has a culture that was shaped by history. Waves of migration have collectively blended to create a pleasant and unique custom, traditions, socio-cultural environment, and rituals. 1.2 Language. Canada is a bilingual country where French and English are both official languages at the federal level. French is the language of the majority in the province of Quebec, and is a significant language in provinces such as New Brunswick and Ontario. Other provinces primarily use English. New Brunswick is only province to appoint both English and French as official languages at the provincial level. A number of Canadians are bilingual, with some understanding of both French and English. Apart from the 2 official languages, several other languages are spoken in Canada. These languages are as a result of migration to the country that has changed over the years. Spanish, Italian, German, Chinese, Arabic, Dutch, Cantonese, Hindi, and several other languages are the minority languages of Canada. 1.3 Urbanism and the use of space. Space has symbolic importance for Canadian culture, in part because of the vastness of Canadian geography coupled with its sparse population, and in part because a sense of distance in Canada has tended to create regional tensions based on the isolation of the larger pockets of the population. Most Canadians live in towns and cities, a trend away from rural residents not unlike that found throughout the rest of the industrialized world. Canadian cities are found at important hubs of interchange between agriculture and manufacturing, such that most 3. Canadian cities emerged as points of connection between farm production and industrial development. Because of this, Canadian cities have tended to develop haphazardly as the larger-scale processes of industrialization and changes in farming have developed. Such historical processes are not amenable to planning. Canadian cities look like cities almost anywhere in the industrialized world, save the fact they tend to be cleaner due to an effect of the way that orderliness has been a dominant feature of the history of Canadian material culture. Canadian cities, even during phases of urban decay, have tended to be more carefully planned and better run, at least in terms of amenities and services, than those in many other industrialized nations. Unlike European cities, however, space in Canadian cities tends to be privatized. While most cities have some space, such as a formal plaza at a city hall, at which public events are held, in general there are no large communal spaces in which social interactions occur. Instead, Canadians in cities of whatever size socialize in private spaces, their homes or commercial sites, such as restaurants. Like cities throughout North America, space in Canadian cities is dominated by movement, and Canadian cities are designed as networks through which goods, vehicles, and people move on their way to or from some place. As such, streets are designed to control the flow of vehicular traffic, to in some way isolate foot traffic, and in all instances to direct traffic toward destinations rather than allow traffic to accumulate. This has led, over the last several decades, to the gradual disappearance of urban commercial streetscapes, replaced by indoor shopping malls as a key destination of traffic flow. Rural towns, however, counter this trend somewhat. Many smaller towns have endeavored to revitalize their commercial streetscapes in recent decades, and the decline of this streetscape is often seen as a sign of the decline and decay of the town as a whole. Residence in Canadian cities is generally private rather than communal, dominated by private homes or residences. Vertical residence structures, such as apartment buildings, dominate much of the urban renewal of core areas in cities, while expansion of cities has been dominated by the development of large tracts of private single-family dwellings. Official architecture in Canada has, historically, been neoclassical, though not to the same extent as one finds in the United States. While official buildings in the early part of the 20th century were often modeled on massive classical buildings, in the latter part of the century these buildings took on shapes not unlike other functional commercial buildings. Key symbolically important buildings, such as courthouses and city halls, are often grand in scale. What marks them today is their diversity rather than the application of a single stylistic model. 4. 1.4 Canadian literature. Canadian literature, the body of written works produced by Canadians. Reflecting the country's dual origin and its official bilingualism, the literature of Canada can be split into two major divisions, English and French. 1.5 The first writers, prose and poetry from settlement to 1900. The first writers of English in Canada were visitors, explorers, travelers, and British officers and their wives, who recorded their impressions of British North America in charts, diaries, journals, and letters. These foundational documents of journeys and settlements presage the documentary tradition in Canadian literature in which geography, history, and arduous voyages of exploration and discovery represent the quest for a myth of origins and for a personal and national identity. 1.6 The earliest documents. The earliest documents were unadorned narratives of travel and exploration. Written in plain language, these accounts document heroic journeys to the vast, unknown West and North and encounters with Inuit and other native peoples, called First Nations in Canada, often on behalf of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, the great fur trading companies. Frances Brooke, the wife of a visiting British military chaplain in the conquered French garrison of Quebec, wrote the first published novel with a Canadian setting. Her History of Emily Montagu, 1769, is an epistolary romance describing the sparkling winter scenery of Quebec and the life and manners of its residents. 1.7 The first literary journal. The first literary journal, the Nova Scotia Magazine, was published in Halifax in 1789. The town's literary activity was invigorated by an influx of loyalists during the American Revolution and by the energetic Joseph Howe, a journalist, a poet, and the first premier of Nova Scotia. Two of the most potent influences on literary development were in evidence by the end of the 18th century: literary magazines and presses and a strong sense of regionalism. By satirizing the dialect, habits, and foibles of Nova Scotians, or Bluenoses, Thomas McCulloch Thomas Chandler Halliburton adroitly brought their region to life and helped found the genre of folk humor. 5. Immigrants, dreaming of a new Eden but encountering instead the realities of unpredictable native peoples, a fierce climate, unfamiliar wildlife, and physical and cultural deprivation, were the subject of prose sketches by the Strickland sisters. 1.8 Modern period, 1900 to 60 poetry. In the early 20th century, popular poets responding to the interest in local color depicted French-Canadian customs and dialect, the Mohawk tribe and rituals, and the freedom and romance of the North. Toronto's Canadian Forum, founded in 1920, which Burney edited from 1936 to 1940, and Montreal's McGill Fortnightly Review, 1925–27, provided an outlet for the new poetry, and the emergence of modernism. Here and in their anthology New Provinces, 1936, A. J. M. Smith, Fr. Scott, and A. M. Klein began their long literary careers. Emphasizing concrete images, open language, and free verse, these modernists felt that the poet's task was to identify, name, and take possession of the land. Klein wrote in Portrait of the Poet as Landscape, 1948, that the poet is the nth atom taking a green inventory, in a world but scarcely uttered, naming, praising. The bonds of a colonial frame of mind characterized by fear of the unknown, reliance on convention, a Puritan consciousness, what Fry, in the conclusion, written for the first edition of the Literary History of Canada, 1965, called the garrison mentality, were being broken and cast off. Strong reaction to the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and World War II dominated the poems of the 1930s and 40s. 1.9 Modern period, 1900 to 60 novels. By 1900 novels of local color were beginning to overshadow historical romances. Lucy Maud Montgomery's beloved children's book Anne of Green Gables, 1908, and its sequels were set in Prince Edward Island. Stephen Leacock's satiric story Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, 1912, and Mazo de la Roque's best-selling Jalna series, 1927–60. Out of the Prairies emerged the novel of social realism, which documented the small, often narrow-minded farming communities pitted against an implacable nature. A tentativeness in form and subject matter pervades the novels published during the 1940s and 50s and is reflected in their protagonists, most of whom are sensitive, restless children or artists. In this category fall the prairie novels As for Me and My House, 1941, by Sinclair Ross, Who Has Seen the Wind, 1947, by W. O. Mitchell. 6. With trenchant irony, Margaret Atwood dissected contemporary urban life in The Edible Woman, 1969, Lady Oracle, 1976, and The Robber Bride, 1993. Bodily Harm, 1981, The Handmaid's Tale, 1985, and The Speculative Oryx and Crake, 2003, are cautionary tales of political violence and dystopia, while Alias Grace, 1996, and The Blind Assassin, 2000, winner of the Booker Prize, are situated in a meticulously researched historical Ontario and expose the secret worlds of women and the ambiguous nature of truth and justice. 1.10 Features of Canadian writing. Many writers publishing in the 1960s and 70s subverted the traditional conventions of fiction, shifting from realist to surrealist, self-reflexive, feminist, or parodic modes. Although historical events and the investigation of place as an imaginative source remained the most common subject matters, the narrative forms were experimental and playful. During the 1980s and 90s, writers also renegotiated ideas of self and nation and a belonging and loss while breaking down traditional boundaries of both gender and genre. Robert Krotesch's trilogy The Words of My Roaring, 1966, The Studhorse Man, 1969, and Gone Indian, 1973, transformed the realism of prairie fiction into postmodern parodies of the quest journey. Although the subject of history exerts a powerful influence on all forms of Canadian writing, the tradition of regional fiction has not lost its momentum. 1.11 During the 1980s and 90s. During the 1980s and 90s, increasing attention was also paid to the plurality and diversity of voices across the country. This period saw the emergence of numerous First Nations, Métis, and Inuit writers. Resisting the imposition of Western concepts of history, land, nation, society, and narrative, many of these writers explored their oral traditions, myths, and cultural practices. A recurring theme is the individual's painful trajectory as that individual negotiates between cultures, combats racial prejudice, and copes with shattered families and kinship groups. These concerns are also rendered in playful or parodic modes, as protest literature, or as alternatives to frenetic urban consumer cultures. Beatrice Culleton, In Search of April Raintree, 1983, Thomas King, Medicine River, 1990, Green Grass, Running Water, 1993, and Eden Robinson, Monkey Beach, 1999, Blood Sports, 2006. Autobiography and Memoir, Maria Campbell's Half-Breed, 1973, and Lee Miracle's Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel, 1975, Reverend. ed. 1990, for example, are key genres in First Nations witnessing and testimony. These genres are also a part of the life writing, which also includes biography. 7. Biofiction, letters and diaries, that dominates the field of Canadian literature and resonates with the tradition of documentary writing. Examples include Ondatya's Running in the Family, 1982. Other perspectives tackle the experiences of immigrants, their interrogation of the meaning of home and belonging, their feelings of cultural assimilation and estrangement, and their intergenerational struggles. Jan Martel's Life of Pi, 2001, winner of the Booker Prize, depicts the fantastic voyage of 16-year-old Pi, who, en route to Canada from India, is shipwrecked and left adrift on the Pacific with several zoo animals. 1.12 Check your progress. 1. Write a brief note on language in Canada. 2. How did Canadians make use of space? 3. Who were the first writers of prose and poetry from settlement to 1900? 4. What were the earliest documents written? 5. Which was the first literary journal? 6. Write a note on the modern period poetry. 7. Write briefly about modern period novels. 8. List some features of Canadian writing. 9. Write about the literature during the 1980s and 90s. References. https://www.everyculture.com/bo-co/canada.html#ixs6arcursp9g www.britannica.com/art/Canadian-literature www.canadastukaralauniv.edu.in/pdf/section_c.pdf For note on authors. https://www.britannica.com/biography/Francis-Reginald-Scott 8. Lesson 2. First Neighbours, PK page. Learning outcome. From this lesson you will learn about the sense of rootlessness that is found in Canadian literature, the search for identity, how the author Kathleen Page expresses the culture of Canada, structure. 2.1 Introduction. 2.2 About the author. 2.3 About the work. 2.4 Summary. 2.5 Check your progress. 2.1 Introduction. The immigrants in Canada had to experience the crisis of rootlessness and search for identity, but they had deep down in their hearts the unforgettable memories of and affinities with the culture of their native country and an intense desire to cultivate that cultural ethos in their adopted country. 2.2 About the author Patricia Kathleen P.K. Page, the 23rd of November 1916 to the 14th of January 2010, was a well-known Canadian poet. She was the author of more than 30 published books that include poetry, fiction, travel diaries, essays, children's books, and an autobiography. Patricia Kathleen P.K. Page, the 23rd of November 1916 to the 14th of January 2010, was best known as a Canadian poet, though the citation as she was inducted as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada reads, poet, novelist, scriptwriter, playwright, essayist, journalist, librettist, teacher and artist. She was the 9. Author of more than 30 published books that include poetry, fiction, travel diaries, essays, children's books, and an autobiography. As a visual artist, she exhibited her work as P.K. Irwin at a number of venues in Canada and abroad. By special resolution of the United Nations, in 2001 Page's poem, Planet Earth, was read simultaneously in New York, the Antarctic, and the South Pacific to celebrate the International Year of Dialogue Among Civilizations. 2.3 About the work First Neighbours. P.K. Page came from England and so her dialect is vary from that of a people of Canada. She expresses her feeling that all human beings are equal and there is no difference in them, but the people of Canada feels that she is different with the shape of her ear. She says that the girl jeered at her for burned bread. The homeland is always secure comparing to the other nations. She says that she has become a minor and invalid. Her remarks are not worthy. Her gestures are silly and sick. She has become a trivial being in the views of her neighbors. The next stanza speaks about her mental state. And she says that finally she has become hardened like a chapped tarpaulin. She started to negotiate and whatever she uttered is of strange meanings to others and vice versa. She wants to connect herself with the others. She brought herself to the level to get connected with them. In the next stanza, she is exploring mindscape through landscape. She says that nothing is steady and everything is inaccurate. Here, the forest is compared to the inner mind. She wants to be connected with them and she gets scared, and then she says that clumsiness and fright are inevitable. Finally she says that prediction is forever impossible. We cannot predict anything. Thus she concludes her poem. In the poem, the speaker puts down the cultural encounters he was forced to face and compelled to adapt. The speaker is caught in an ambiguous situation at last and is in a dilemma, whether to resume to the native condition or surrender to the culture and unpredictable conditions. All the experiences suggest to the speaker to go back, where you came from. 2.4 Summary. From this lesson you have come to understand the sense of rootlessness that is found in Canadian literature, the search for identity, and how the author Kathleen Page expresses the culture of Canada through her works. 10. 2.5 Check your progress. 1. What was the feeling of the page when she first came to Canada? 2. Comment on the loss of culture of immigrants to Canada. Reference: https://www.poetryfoundation.org/poets/p-k-page. 11. Lesson 3. Indian Reservation. Caughnawaga, A.M. Klein. Learning outcome. From this lesson you will learn: what are Klein's feelings on loss of civilization? Feeling of loss of culture. Importance of heritage. Structure. 3.1 Introduction. 3.2 About the author. 3.3 About the work. 3.4 Detailed analysis of poem. 3.5 Klein's feelings of disappearance of culture. 3.6 Klein on preservation of traditions. 3.7 Summary. 3.8 Check your progress. 3.1 Introduction. A.M. Klein was born in February 1909. He was a poet, journalist, novelist, short story writer and lawyer. However, he is best known for his poetry. Klein's Jewish identity informed much of his works, particularly his poems, some of the most famous of which were written about things like the Holocaust and compiled in his first volume of poetry, Hath Not a Jew. 3.2 About the author. For much of his career, Klein's work was widely loved and well reviewed. The Canadian Encyclopedia summed up Klein beautifully. Klein has rightly been called the first contributor. 12. Of authentic Jewish poetry to the English language. His writings articulate the feelings of a generation that witnessed the destruction of European Jewry and the fulfillment of the Zionist dream. Klein believed the function of his writing to be educational. As M. W. Steinberg noted in the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Klein sought to inform the non-Jewish world of the Jewish condition, its achievements and its plight, but even more important, to convey to the young Jewish North American-born generation some knowledge of their cultural heritage. 3.3 About the poem. Indian Reservation. Caughnawaga, name of the colony inhabited by Red Indians, epitomizes Klein's feelings that the civilization of the Red Indians has disappeared and can never be revived or revitalized. 3.4 Detailed analysis of poem. In the first stanza of Indian Reservation Caughnawaga, the speaker hints at the diminution of the native Indian culture using rhetorical questions that begin with the word, where. Some of the cultural ingredients that cannot be traced, based on the rhetorical questions, include the braves, the monosyllabic chiefs, the tribes, and Aesop animals. The untraceability of these critical components of the native Indian culture means that the native Indians, at Caughnawaga, have given up their distinctive, orthodox culture. Klein then proceeds to describe the degradation of the Red Indian civilization. The Red Indians have given up their traditional lifestyle, being lured by the commercial Western culture. They adopt modern French names. They neither daub themselves with paints nor wear bronze jewels. The Red Indian, squaws' wives, no longer cover themselves with vegetables outfit which puffed like a tent. The Red Indians nowadays wear overalls. They grow very commercial and degrade themselves by adorning themselves with bedraggled feathers and dancing their traditional dance to please a white mayor after receiving a bribe. Their children biteth dust to pick up the brown pennies thrown by the tourists at church doors. Klein laments in the last stanza that the relics of Red Indian civilization have become saleable commodities. He mourns that their past is sold in the shop. The things once used by them, such as the beaded shoes, the sweet grass baskets, the burnt wood by which they drew designs on their bodies, gaudy clothes, and inch canoes, are affordable for sales now. The grassy ghetto is no more their home and are preserved as relics in the museum. Hunting occupies no place in their life. The fauna or animals hunted by them at the risk of their life are also kept in the museum with their pale and bleached bodies. They have abandoned their 13 native religion and converted to Christianity. They become pious and prosperous, but Klein rejects them as ghosts of their vital original selves, as there is nothing original in them. 3.5 Klein's feelings of disappearance of culture. The poem epitomizes Klein's feelings that the civilization of the Red Indians has disappeared and can never be revived or revitalized. Klein portrays the changing times in the lives of Indians from Caughnawaga. He attacks the influence of the French culture on the Indians, so the psyche of these races of people are molded into thinking the cultures of the foreigners as superior, in turn making their culture feel inferior. This indeed is a power play by the foreigners, as we find that the whole society gives in, gradually making them a stranger to their own culture. The poet tries to compare the lives of the Red Indians with that of the Jews in Nazi Germany. Though A.M. Klein was a Jew, yet he does not reflect the atrocities of humanity as suffered by those million Jews in the Second World War. The poet does not dwell on injustice committed in particular against his own ethnic group. In this poem, he grieves the collapse of the humanist ideal. He identifies his own plight with another important instance of ethnic persecution. Glinter, 2008, in Indian Reservation, Caughnawaga, Klein highlights the maiming of the Indian culture and tradition. This is a grassy ghetto, and no home. And these are fauna in a museum kept. The better hunters have prevailed. The game, losing its blood, now makes these grounds its crypt. Klein, 2000. 3.6 Klein on preservation of traditions. Klein advocates preservation of traditions. Those who alienate themselves from the traditions are dismissed by him as mere ghosts. In this poem, Klein depicts the corrosive impact that the Western culture has effected on the Red Indians' traditional lifestyle. Klein laments the extinction of the ancient Red Indian race in the first stanza of the poem as follows: "Where are the braves, the faces like autumn fruit, who stared at the child from the colored frontispiece? And the monosyllabic chief who spoke with his throat?" Klein, 2000. Klein records his ache to meet the brave Red Indians whose faces were like the autumn fruit. The autumn fruit stands for the possession of ripe wisdom by Red Indians. The poet longs to see the Red Indians standing at their frontispiece, the doorstep, gazing at their children walking out. He is very eager to meet the monosyllabic chief who spoke briefly in a gruff and guttural voice. He calls the Red Indians affectionately as feathered bestiaries, because they with their fur and feathers resemble mythic animals such as Chief Running Deer, Black Bear, and Old Buffalo Head featured in the Aesop's fables. He says, "Where are the tribes, the feathered bestiaries? Rank Aesop's animals erect and red, with fur on their names to make all live things kin Chief Running Deer, Black Bear." 14. Old Buffalo Head? Klein, 2000. Klein then proceeds to describe the degradation of the Red Indian civilization. The Red Indians have given up their traditional lifestyle, being lured by the commercial Western culture. 3.7 Summary. After reading this lesson, you would have learned what are Klein's feelings on loss of civilization, the intense feeling of loss of culture, and the importance of heritage. 3.8 Check your progress. 1. Explain the line "Where are the tribes, the feathered bestiaries?" 2. How does Klein identify his own plight with another important instance of ethnic persecution? 3. What are the main issues dealt with in the poem Indian Reservation, Caughnawaga? 4. What are the things that have disappeared from traditional Red Indian lives due to loss of culture? References. http://www.eliteskills.com/analysis_poetry https://www.poetryfoundation.org/poets/a-m-klein 15. Lesson 4. The Cattle Thief, Emily Pauline Johnson. Learning outcome. From this lesson you will learn how invaders practice oppressive tendencies on natives, how native culture is being eroded, how natives are feeling threatened by loss of culture and homeland. Structure. 4.1 Introduction. 4.2 About the author. 4.3 About the work. 4.4 Detailed analysis of poem. 4.5 Images and symbols used in the poem. 4.6 Summary. 4.7 Check your progress. 4.1 Introduction. This poem speaks about oppression and good versus evil. Johnson uses images, symbols, and similes for emphasizing these themes. 4.2 About the author. Born and raised on Six Nations Reserve near Brantford, Ontario, poet and performer Emily Pauline Johnson was the daughter of a Mohawk chief and his English wife. She was educated mainly at home, studying both English literature and Mohawk oral history and legend. Emily Pauline Johnson, Tekahianwake, she was born and lived on the Six Nations Reservation near Brantford, Ontario. On the Six Nations Reservation, Johnson and her family lived in a 16 mansion called Chiefswood. After her father's death, her family were unable to afford Chiefswood and moved to Brantford. Johnson had very little formal education. She attended the Brantford Model School and was not able to attend college. Even though Johnson was not able to get a formal education, she was still a very successful poet. By her late teens she was an accomplished poet, and in 1892, Johnson was reciting her poems audiences all around southern Ontario. Pauline raised enough money to travel to England. There she found a publisher to publish her first book of poetry called The White Wigwam. She based most of her stories from native legends or subjects, but she also wrote stories about her travels and life. She often could make her audiences cry, tremble with fear, laugh, or rejoice in happiness. Even with her success on the road and the success with her writing, she never made much money. The money she did make went to her travel expenses. She died of cancer in 1913. After her death in 1913, 2 more of Johnson's books were published. The first was The Moccasin Maker, a collection of her short stories about the experiences of Canadian Indians and mixed bloods. Johnson's last book was called The Shaganappi. Pauline continues to be one of the greatest female Canadian Indian poets and is still an influence on many natives. 4.3 About the poem, The Cattle Thief, 1895. The Cattle Thief begins with the chasing down, confrontation, and killing of a Cree chief by English settlers. It then shifts, as the daughter of the chief comes and rebukes the killers, undermining their ideas about the land, food, ownership, and religion. This poem was originally published in The White Wampum. 4.4 Detailed analysis of the poem. The Cattle Thief, by E. Pauline Johnson, presents a scenario where an indigenous chief is murdered for stealing the settlers' cattle, but in reality, the leader was protecting his people from oppressive tendencies. The poet relies on literary techniques to make the poem interesting and engaging for the audience. The poet reveals the theme of oppression since the settlers are referring to the Eagle Chief as the cattle thief. Evidently, they are seeking a reason to get rid of the leader since he has been interfering with some of their plans that focus on exploiting the indigenous community. After they had murdered the Eagle Chief, one of the women among the indigenous people decides to confront the settlers, and questions them about their motives. In the process, the audience understands some of the atrocities that the settlers have committed against the indigenous community. The lady reveals that, "You have cursed, and called him a cattle thief, though you robbed him first of bread." Johnson line 46. She even reveals how they no longer have enough land, game, and her people are suffering because of widespread 17. Hunger. These accusations illustrate another perspective of the situation that the settlers have ignored as they were murdering the Eagle Chief. At that point, the Indian lady asks the settlers, "What have you brought but evil, and curses since you came?" The statement shows their pain and the extreme oppression that they have been experiencing in the hands of the settlers. The Indian lady insists that, "Give back the peace and the plenty." The assumption illustrates that the community has been missing these important aspects that they are still pursuing. Hence, they are seeking an end to the oppression that they have been encountering since they need a society that considers respect and a sense of togetherness. The settlers are looking at the leader as a desperate cattle thief, and a monstrous, fearless Indian, who thieved and raided, and scouted. The detailed description captures how the Eagle Chief is a criminal that should be executed or incarcerated due to his evil acts. However, the illustration only shows the settlers' point of view. Hence, later, the poet relies on an Indian lady that stands up to the settlers, and she reveals some of the atrocities that they have committed against her people. For instance, the Indian lady insists that, "Buy a book, to save our souls from the sins you brought in your other hand. Go back with your new religion, we never have understood." The statement shows how the settlers are introducing Christianity, but their practices are not adhering to the good news. After they have accused the Eagle Chief of stealing their cattle, the Indian lady tells the settlers that, "When you pay for the land you live in, we'll pay for the meat we eat." As a result, the indigenous community also shows that they are not criminals, and the settlers are engaging in evil practices that are affecting them in a negative way. 4.5 Images and symbols used in the poem. In the poem, Johnson reveals that, "He turned, like a hunted lion. I know not fear, said he," line 23. The illustration is symbolic because it shows how the Eagle Chief was a valuable treasure that they had been pursuing. Furthermore, it was an essential way of clarifying his position, power, and influence among the indigenous community. The fact that the Eagle Chief is represented as an exotic trophy captures how he was an obstacle to their initiatives of controlling and undermining the well-being of the region. Images are integrated into the poem to capture the emotions and motives of the settlers. Johnson shows how the settlers were galloping hard and fast, as they were looking for the Eagle Chief, line 1. The description illustrates how they have the intent to find their target and convict him of non-existent crimes. The poet romanticizes the situation by insisting that they were desperate riders, that had sighted their man at last, line 2. Similes are incorporated into the poem. For instance, the settlers describe that the fearless Indian usually, who rode like a hurricane. Johnson shows that the settlers cursed 18. Like a troop of demons, after they had failed to catch the Eagle Chief, line 14. Some of these similes create a proper picture of the narration and how the settlers were trying to undermine the Eagle Chief's authority by portraying him as the enemy. The poem focuses on the theme of oppression and good versus evil to portray the sufferings of the indigenous communities in the hands of settlers that were exploiting them. 4.6 Summary. After reading this lesson you learnt how invaders practice oppressive tendencies on natives in order to intimidate them, and how native culture is being eroded. You also understood how natives are feeling threatened by loss of culture and homeland. 4.7 Check your progress. 1. What does this poem say about colonial settlement practices and attempts to erase indigenous culture? What does it reveal about settler-indigenous relations? 2. What are the differences between the woman and the English settlers in The Cattle Thief? 3. What possibilities for reconciliation does the poem The Cattle Thief offer? References. https://www.poetryfoundation.org/poets/Emily-Pauline-Johnson. 19. Lesson 5. Like an Old Proud King in a Parable, by A.J.M. Smith. Learning outcome. After reading this poem you will understand the skill of A.J.M. Smith as a poet. Know the place of Smith among the Canadian plethora of poets. Structure. 5.1 Introduction. 5.2 About the writer. 5.3 About the work. 5.4 As a metaphysical poem. 5.5 Need for change. 5.6 Detailed analysis of poem. 5.7 Summary. 5.8 Check your progress. 5.1 Introduction. From its initial reviews over a decade ago to the most recent studies, A.J.M. Smith's poems New and Collected has been both celebrated and criticized for its awesome, or troublesome, range of poetic variations. Not surprisingly, since this volume alone constitutes the poet's oeuvre, they establish Smith as a skilled craftsman. 5.2 About the writer. Arthur James Marshall Smith, November 8, 1902 to November 21, 1980, was a Canadian poet and anthologist. He was a prominent member of a group of Montreal poets, the Montreal 20 group, which included Leon Adele, Leo Kennedy, A.M. Klein, and F.R. Scott, who distinguished themselves by their modernism in a culture still rigidly rooted in Victorianism. Smith received his doctorate from the University of Edinburgh in 1931. 5.3 About the work. Like an Old Proud King in a Parable is a poem that was published in New Provinces, the first anthology of modern Canadian poetry, which was edited by F.R. Scott and A.J.M. Smith. The poem was originally published in the McGill Fortnightly Review in 1928 before making it into the anthology in 1936. In the introduction to the Book of Canadian Poetry, Smith writes of the modern revival that began in the 20s with a simplification of the technique. Smith's goal within his own poetry was to create something new and uniquely Canadian, though he understood the benefits of learning from the classical poets. He continues by saying that, following the lead of the new poets in the United States and the Georgians in England, Canadian poets turned against rhetoric, sought a sharper, more objective imagery, and limited themselves as far as possible to the language of everyday and the rhythms of speech. Like an Old Proud King in a Parable is a prime example of the mix of new Canadian poetry and the acknowledgement of the poets that came before. 5.4 As a metaphysical poem. Like an Old Proud King in a Parable is primarily a metaphysical poem. A metaphysical poem uses figurative language and a way of organizing the meditative process or the poetic argument. Abrams 192. Related to the metaphysical poem is the metaphysical conceit, which combines dissimilar images and the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Abrams 53. Smith combines the idea of a bitter king, 1, with the disillusionment of power. The king wants nothing more than to be away from the fawning courtier and doting queen, which is the opposite of the traditional romantic poem. John Ferns writes, the bitter king of the poem can be seen as the poet's persona, but he is not necessarily to be seen as the poet himself. Within this metaphysical structure, the speaker of the poem is not necessarily the same as the writer of the poem. The bitter king represents the breaking away from the Romantic and Victorian traditions that Canadian poetry revolved around at the time. Smith spent his whole career trying to create a distinctly Canadian poetry away from the past. Smith in this signature poem seems to be defining the Canadian poet's situation. At the same time he seeks to thin Canadian nature poetry down to a new purity. 21. And toughness, avoiding descriptive excess. In breaking away from the traditions that have trapped Canadian poetry in the past, Smith begins to create something uniquely Canadian. He uses the metaphysical language of the poem to escape from the artificial in pursuit of the natural. And this is an expression of Smith's love for the Canadian landscape. Smith wishes to get away from the artificiality of the Romantics and Victorians and speak more to the natural Canadian landscape and Canadian character. In seeking this character through something like a parable, Smith leads by example and not by demand. 5.5 Need for change. Like an Old Proud King in a Parable, demonstrates Smith's need for a change in the way that Canadian poetry is written. He uses the figure of the bitter king to represent the new, modern Canadian poet who wishes to break away from the old traditions, represented by the fawning courtiers and doting queen. This poem is a representation of everything that Smith worked for in his career. 5.6 Detailed analysis of poem. Whether the scene conjured up by Smith in the above passage owes its inspiration, as well as its imagery, more to Yeats' descriptions of the Galway coast than to his own, The Lonely Land, is difficult to determine and is of secondary concern to a more striking, and for the present discussion, more important feature of the passage: the analogy made in it between poet, king and poetry, queen. The importance of the analogy resides in the facts that it immediately recalls the characters and the act of divestment or abdication in, like an old, proud king in a parable. The invocation of the Father in the poem's last stanza, though reverential in tone, need not be confined to a strictly religious reading. Indeed, other than the obvious connotations of the parable form, the religious reading does not especially suit the matter of this poem. Smith is invoking the Father, Yeats as his master craftsman and perhaps even as his muse. The poet pledges himself, "And I will sing to the barren rock your difficult, lonely music, heart, like an old proud king in a parable." 22. The separation of the personal adjective, your, from its noun, heart, leaves the reader the length of the line to imagine that the difficult, lonely music belongs to the Father, who is still being addressed. The grammatical connection with heart at the line's end does not wholly negate the previously made association. In fact, the spiritual bond formed in the poem would suggest that the distance between the Father, Yeats and Smith's heart is not great. Further, the spiritual tie instigated and confirmed by the generical nature of parable permits the last line to signify that the poet, Smith, will sing his heart's song in the manner of the old, proud king, Yeats. There is, however, a less specifically Yeatsian reading of the poem, stemming still from the simile in the thesis on Yeats. The bitter king, bitter because deluded by the trappings of poetical convention being imposed upon him, i.e. Smith's delineation of the demands made on the Canadian poet to talk romantically of snowshoes etc., must divest himself of the gilt crown, the hollow scepter, the doting but ultimately tyrannical queen, oppressively emotional poetry. Rather than stalk about in another's apparel, the poet must start afresh, must renounce the comforts of the fat royal life, the easily made poetry embroidered by luxuriant but vacuous emotions. His act of breaking bound is an act of defiance, an abdication of his public role in order to answer the heart that caroled like a swan. Like an old, proud king in a parable is undoubtedly one of Smith's most important poems. Its placement at the head of his collections advises us that the poet still accepts its credo and its poetical theory. What clearly sets Like an Old, Proud King in a Parable apart from other two obviously Yeatsian, early poems is that it transcends its sources to become a sincere, almost private, statement and a successful, self-contained poem. The poetry begins to gain resonance when Smith's understanding of his predecessors and contemporaries is clarified. 5.7 Summary. After reading this poem you will have understood the skill of A.J.M. Smith as a poet. You will have understood the position held by the poet among the Canadian poets. 23. 5.8 Check your progress. 1. How is Like an Old Proud King in a Parable a metaphysical poem? 2. Analyze A.J.M. Smith as a typical Canadian poet? 3. Give a detailed analysis of the poem by A.J.M. Smith. References. http://canadianpoetry.org/volume/volume4/mclaren.html. 24. Lesson 6. Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, Thomas King. Learning outcome. After reading this lesson you will understand what King means by post-colonial literature. Method by which we can look at literature of the oppressed. Understand the feelings of the colonized and the colonizer. Structure. 6.1 Introduction. 6.2 About the author. 6.3 About the work. 6.4 King's argument. 6.5 Main ideas in the work. 6.6 Summary. 6.7 Check your progress. 6.1 Introduction. King's article, Godzilla versus the Post-colonial, points out problematic issues surrounding the term, post-colonial. The term generalizes numerous races and cultures together instead of creating a distinction and forms a binary between Europeans and those who have been colonized. In this essay, Thomas King emphasizes that post-colonial literature must be produced by the native people at any given time. The scholarly idea that has had the greatest impact on English studies in Canada is Thomas King's argument that native literature is not post-colonial. Godzilla vs. Post-colonial. 25. 6.2 About the author. Thomas King was born in Sacramento, California in 1943. He is of Cherokee, German and Greek descent. King was raised in California, later becoming a photojournalist in Australia. In 1986, he completed his Ph.D. in English and American Studies at the University of Utah. He has taught Native Studies at the University of California, the University of Lethbridge and at the University of Minnesota, where he was also chair of American Indian Studies. King is currently a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph, west of Toronto. King published his first novel Medicine River in 1989. It marked him as an important voice in Canadian literature. His use of humor, well-crafted dialogue, influenced by his interest in traditional oral literature, and an honest portrayal of day-to-day life of natives marked the book as an important work of fiction. In 1990, King tried to radically redefine how theorists view native literature. In the article Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, King challenges the view that all native literature is a reaction to colonialism, rather than an extension of longer native tradition. The term post-colonial serves, in King's opinion, to reinforce the legacy of colonization. King's article, Godzilla versus the Post-colonial, points out problematic issues surrounding the term, post-colonial. The term generalizes numerous races and cultures together instead of creating a distinction and forms a binary between Europeans and those who have been colonized. 6.3 About the work. Thomas King emphasizes that post-colonial literature must be produced by the native people at any given time following their homeland's colonization by a foreign entity. Such post-colonial literature can be categorized by four terms: tribal, interfusional, polemical, and associational. Tribal literature exists primarily within a tribe or community and is almost exclusively available to that specific tribe and is written in their native dialect. Polemical refers to literature that is either in a native language or a more common language such as French, English, Spanish, etc. Polemical literature typically concerns itself with the clash of native and non-native cultures. Interfusional literature describes a native literature that is a blend of oral and written literature. Associational literature is commonly a body of literature that is created for contemporary native writers and often describes native communities. As a whole, these four categories or subsets of post-colonial literature by native peoples allows us as critics to assess native works through the notion that there is a usable past of literature and a cultural tenacity for a viable future which may well organize itself around major revivals of language, philosophy, and spiritualism. 26. In Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, King chooses to interpret post-colonialism in a way which many theoreticians have expressly resisted, as suggesting after-colonialism. This isn't the place to rehearse the at times tortured lengths many critics have gone to insist that post-coloniality does not chart causality, that the post, in post-colonialism does not imply business as usual, only more so, or to mount the arguments which maintain that it does. Rather, it is important to insist, as King does, that however the interpretation of post-colonialism is structured, there is no escaping the fact that at least one eternally present reading of the compound word, with or without the hyphen, suggests that native writing, and culture, begins with European contact. As King puts it, while post-colonialism purports to be a method by which we can begin to look at those literatures which are formed out of the struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor, the colonized and the colonizer, the term itself assumes that the starting point for that discussion is the advent of Europeans in North America. At the same time, the term organizes the literature progressively, suggesting that there is both progress and improvement. No less distressing, it also assumes that the struggle between guardian and ward is the catalyst for contemporary native literature, providing those of us who write with method topic. And, worst of all, the idea of post-colonial writing effectively cuts us off from our traditions that were in place before colonialism ever became a question, traditions which have come down to us through our cultures in spite of colonization, and it supposes that contemporary native writing is largely a construct of oppression. 6.4 King's argument. In this article, King argues for a series of terms by which to read native writing, terms such as tribal, interfusional, polemical and associational, which do not establish a chronological order nor do they open and close literary frontiers. They avoid a nationalistic center, and they do not depend on the arrival of Europeans for their raison d'être. He concedes, however, that these terms will not do in the end at all. Yet I cannot let post-colonial stand, particularly as a term, for, at its heart, it is an act of imagination and an act of imperialism that demands that I imagine myself as something I did not choose to be, as something I would not choose to become. It will also not do, however, to try to pin King down too inflexibly to the terms and arguments he himself engenders. Because as well as launching an important attack on the dangers of assumptions, and on the potentially regressive effects of a post-colonial strategy, King is also inhabiting the position of trickster throughout his article, mobilizing a series of terms and arguments, and then doubling back on them. Many of his stories would fall into the category which he calls polemical, that is, literature either in a native language or in English, French, etc. that concerns itself with the clash of 27 native and non-native cultures or with the championing of native values over non-native values. The term polemical itself insists on reading through opposition and debate, through a dialectic of sorts, between native and non-native terms. His terminology insists on politicizing the space of the native and non-native in a way which the post-colonial, at times, does not. Showhat, for example, points to the way the term post-colonial becomes for some a type of benign label, which through a diplomatic gesture, relinquishes the terrorizing terms, imperialism, and neo-colonialism, in favor of the pastoral post-colonial. And yet, as the epigraph to this article makes emphatically clear, what is pastoral to some is positively Gothic to others. King's work can be read according to specific post-colonial strategies of resistance and abrogation. His primary mode is an appropriative one, largely involving the exorbitant rewriting of canonical literary texts from the other side of the colonial divide. Sleman, 188. And yet it is also true to say that much of his work refuses such a focus. In Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, he suggests a number of categories of writing that ignore this emphasis in favor of native issues. In an interview with Herman Lutz, King maintained that he was tired of negative descriptions of Indians, whether Indians develop them or whether non-Indians develop them, and I'm tired of romantic images too. So, I would like to see some very calm, very ordinary images, Indians doing ordinary things. This is in fact the way his first novel, Medicine River, is framed. King's writing also frequently focuses on material which non-native people simply have no access to, reminding them that they are outsiders to this culture which they often so readily feel they own or to which they feel they should have unrestricted access. This is especially true about the Sundance ceremony, which plays such a key role in his novel Green Grass, Running Water. 6.5 Main ideas in the work. Godzilla, then, seems entirely appropriate. The star of Japanese pop culture is forever being chased out of his own space by a well-armed, militaristic nation. And yet Godzilla returns again and again, in sequel after sequel, never to be defeated despite the insistent narratives which proclaim his inevitable extinction. Godzilla is invariably the star of the show. King's title is a typically irreverent, anachronistic, and yet no less pointed, comment on monstrosity and abjection, and on the reclamation of the imaginary. It is a brilliantly monstrous remark on history. Or, to put it another way, post-colonial critics have assumed that they owned the court. Now it turns out that all along they've been playing basketball with Godzilla. Interfusional literature is one of the four terms which Thomas King has suggested to describe the range of native writing in North America, together with tribal, polemical and associational. 28. In his article, Godzilla vs. Post-colonial 1990, he defines all four in detail, and includes under the heading of interfusional literature the narratives that are written down in English and adapted for wide circulation, but retain the typical native voice of the storyteller as well as traditional themes and oral discursive devices. King observes that, although there are other authors, such as Dennis Tedlick, Del Himes and Howard Norman, whose works in translation suggest the nature of interfusional literature, Harry Robinson's Write It on Your Heart is the only complete example we have of it. 244. According to King, the stories in Robinson's collection are told in English and written in English, but the patterns, metaphors, structures as well as the themes and characters come primarily from oral literature. 244. King praises Robinson for being successful in creating an oral voice, something he does in a rather ingenious way, for he develops an oral syntax that defeats readers' efforts to read the stories silently to themselves, a syntax that encourages readers to read the stories out loud. 244. King commends Robinson's prose for avoiding the loss of what is generally omitted when oral literature is translated and for recreating at once the storyteller and the performance. 244. In Godzilla vs. Post-colonial, the last comment about interfusional literature constitutes an explicit acknowledgement of King's literary debt to the Okanagan storyteller, for the author concludes the essay with the following statement about Robinson: his prose has become a source of inspiration and influence for other native writers such as Jeanette Armstrong and myself. 245. 6.6 Summary. From this lesson you learnt what is post-colonial literature. You also understood the method by which we can look at literature of the oppressed and the oppressor. You also understood the viewpoints of the colonized and the colonizer. 6.7 Check your progress. 1. How does Thomas King view colonialism? 2. What does Godzilla symbolize? 3. How is the essay Godzilla reflect the struggle of the oppressed against the oppressor? References. wordpress.com/2015/04/04/Godzilla-vs-post-colonial-Thomas-King/ https://igel.com/ojs/index.php/ojs/article/download/. 29. Lesson 7. Disunity is Unity. A Canadian Strategy, Robert Krotesch. Learning Outcomes. After reading this lesson you will understand that Canadians share an ironic sense of identity, an identity characterized by doubleness. They have an awareness of the plural and unstable nature of identity. In the Canadian tradition, namelessness is a self-imposed and deliberate strategy. Structure. 7.1 Introduction. 7.2 About the writer. 7.3 About the work. 7.4 National identity. 7.5 Namelessness. 7.6 Meta-narrative and disunity. 7.7 Summary. 7.8 Check your progress. 7.1 Introduction. Krotesch is considered one of Canada's foremost practitioners and theoreticians of postmodern literature. Like many experimental writers, Krotesch subverts such literary conventions as plot and character development and writes in a playful, ironic, and self-reflexive style. Central to Krotesch's fiction is the importance of place and its impact on the psyche. He is particularly admired for his depictions of the Canadian prairie landscape. 30. 7.2 About the writer. Robert Krotesch, 1927, is a Canadian novelist, poet, critic, editor, and travel writer. Krotesch was born in Hyssler, Alberta, Canada, and raised on his family's farm. His childhood in rural Alberta, where most of his fiction is set, informs both his fiction and his poetry. His family's penchant for storytelling imbued Krotesch with a deep appreciation for oral narrative, which often emerges in his writing in the form of tall tales and ribald humor. After graduating from the University of Alberta in 1948, Krotesch worked for 6 years in the Canadian North. His initial jobs on riverboats on the Mackenzie River led to the conception of his first and most conventional novel, But We Are Exiles, 1966. In 1961 Krotesch received his Ph.D. from the University of Iowa, and he worked as a professor at the State University of New York at Binghamton from 1961 to 1978. In 1978 Krotesch accepted a professorship at the University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. He has won several awards for his fiction and was co-founder and editor of the postmodern literary journal Boundary 2. 7.3 about the work. In his essay, Disunity as Unity, A Canadian Strategy, Krotesch explains, meta-narrative, as concerns with the narrative itself, the shared story has traditionally been basic to nationhood. In the Canadian context, recent metacritical reflection has challenged metaphors of unity. Such metaphors implied that all cultural expressions are shaped by the same national character. W. H. New's introduction to the 4th volume of the Literary History of Canada, published in 1990 and covering the period from 1972 to 1984, as definitively marking the movement away from such older critical assumptions. As far the 1970s and 1980s are concerned, historians essentially gave up any fixed notion of the whole society. The whole was inapprehensible, in flux. Criticism, too, edged away from seeing literature as foremost an expression of a single national character. Recent research in psychology called into question a related notion about the wholeness of the self. 7.4 National identity. In keeping with the critical examination of nation and national identity, Canadian literary and cultural criticism over the last number of years has emphasized the view that Canadians have no single, definable national identity, except, perhaps, insofar as Canadians' peculiar awareness of multiplicity and difference might itself be said to constitute an identity in contrast to the more statically and totalizingly conceived identities of other nations. 31. Likewise, it is asserted that Canadians share an ironic sense of identity, an identity characterized by doubleness and an awareness of the plural, differential, discursive and hence unstable nature of identity, be these identities of gender, race, ethnicity, or that which most problematically attempts to encompass all of these, nation. In the essay, No Name is My Name, collected in The Lovely Treachery of Words, Krotesch suggests that Canadian literature has long resisted and put into question assertions of a stable definable identity, whether such assertions be as specific as the identity of the self or as general as the identity of the nation. In arguing this idea he points fascinatingly to what he sees as the uncanny repetition, from the pre-Confederation writings of Thomas Halliburton's Sam Slick stories, to Sinclair Ross's As for Me and My House, A. M. Klein's The Second Scroll, Hubert Aquin's Prochain episode, and Margaret Atwood's Surfacing, of a nameless narrator, the supposed origin and center of the narrative that refuses to name itself. He invites us to think contrastingly of that cornerstone of the American literary tradition that begins with the confident assertion of name, "Call me Ishmael." In the American tradition, Krotesch argues, when nameless characters appear, as in Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, their namelessness has often been imposed upon them by oppressive social forces. In the Canadian tradition, namelessness is a self-imposed and deliberate strategy. Such namelessness, furthermore, makes itself evident not only in a nameless narrator, but in the characteristically marginal locations of much Canadian literature, such as Sinclair Ross's fictional prairie town of Horizon, which, as Krotesch writes, suggests a no place that is tantalizingly visible but always out of reach, a version of namelessness. And novels such as Klein's The Second Scroll and Atwood's Surfacing, in addition to having unnamed narrators, explore self-consciously the difficulties of naming, the problematic relation of sign and referent. 7.5. Namelessness. Krotesch suggests toward the end of the essay that this prevalence of namelessness and problems of naming in Canadian literature may be significant for several reasons. The initial reasons he lists would regard namelessness as a negative condition that might eventually be surmounted in the positivity of an achieved identity. First, there is the problem the Canadian writer in English or French confronts of writing in a language inherited from elsewhere. Krotesch writes, the problem then is not so much that of knowing one's identity as it is that of how to relate that newly evolving identity to its inherited or, given, names. And the first technique might be simply to hold those names in suspension, to let the identity speak itself out of a willed namelessness. 32. Second, Krotesch relates such namelessness to Canada's sense of powerlessness vis-a-vis the United States and what Krotesch conceives as America's own powerfully confident definitions of self, freedom, heroism, society, nature, happiness. He concludes, by suggesting that Canadians might look at such namelessness in a more positive light. Namelessness may indeed be a space of freedom and plurality, a generative place, just as the nameless narrators of the texts Krotesch examines end up, despite their namelessness, and perhaps because of their namelessness, generating story. Krotesch concludes, it may be the villain, namelessness, turns out to be the hero in the story of the Canadian story. That for Krotesch the Canadian identity should reside in a certain namelessness is in keeping with his suggestion, explored in the essay, Disunity as Unity, a Canadian strategy, that Canada is a postmodern country. 7.6 Meta-narrative and disunity. An assumed story, or a meta-narrative, Krotesch asserts in this essay, has traditionally been basic to nationhood. Again, Krotesch's point of reference is primarily the United States. He writes, an obvious example of such a meta-narrative is the persistence of the American dream, with its assumptions about individual freedom, the importance of the frontier, the immigrant experience. Traditionally, one of the functions of art, Krotesch argues, has been the location and elaboration of such national meta-narratives. Unlike Americans, however, Canadians have never been able to agree upon an overarching shared story that would encompass and unify their nationhood. We see this for example in the often commented upon absence of national heroes in Canadian culture, those central characters in a metanarrative of nation. In its culture and its politics Canada has been characterized, rather, by debate and irresolution about its defining metanarrative, by both a search for and a resistance to metanarrative. Like the namelessness that is Canada's name, this disunity, Krotesch suggests, is in fact Canada's unity. Like namelessness, disunity is not a negative condition that should be bemoaned. The debate and irresolution of disunity is valorized as an open-ended Bakhtinian dialogism that permits of freedom and heterogeneity. As Krotesch writes, we, Canadians, survive by working with a low level of self-definition and national definition. We insist on staying multiple. Thus, in its Lyottardian incredulity toward the unifying metanarrative Canada has long been a postmodern nation, and Krotesch finds it significant that it should have been the government. 33. Of Quebec that commissioned this French philosopher to write the postmodern condition. To the extent that the world is becoming more postmodern, Canada, Krotesch implies, is ahead of the game, further along the historical path, certainly than the United States. Canada was largely invisible in the centralizing era of modernism, but now that we have entered the postmodern epoch of the margins Canada is coming into its own. And to the extent that nations have traditionally depended upon unifying metanarratives, Canada may be, in the phrase of another of Krotesch's essays in this collection, beyond nationalism. Canada is, Krotesch seems to imply, paradoxically a postnational nation. Krotesch's main notion is the namelessness that is Canada's name and the disunity that is its unity. 7.7 Summary. After reading this lesson you learnt that Canadians share an ironic sense of identity, an identity characterized by doubleness. You also understood that they have an awareness of the plural and unstable nature of identity. You understood that in the Canadian tradition namelessness is a self-imposed and deliberate strategy. 7.8 Check your progress. 1. Do Canadians have a single, definable national identity? 2. Disunity, Krotesch suggests, is in fact Canada's unity comment. 3. What does Krotesch mean by namelessness? Reference. http://canadian-writers.athabascal.ca/english/writers/rkrotesch.php. 34. Lesson 8. The Edible Woman, Margaret Atwood. Learning outcome. From this less you will learn about one of the most intelligent and talented writers who tried to decipher life in the late 20th century. The search for oneself and gender roles and identity. About women and their relationships to men and to society. Structure. 8.1 Introduction. 8.2 About the author. 8.3 About the work. 8.4 Summary of the story The Edible Woman. 8.5 Main characters in the story. 8.6 Summary. 8.7 Check your progress. 8.1 Introduction. The Edible Woman is the first novel by Margaret Atwood, published in 1969. It tells the story of a young woman who struggles with society, her fiancé, and food. It is often discussed as an early work of feminism. She creates strong protagonists and is known for exploring feminist issues and other questions of contemporary society in unique ways. Margaret Atwood is one of the most prominent Canadian writers and a major figure in contemporary literature. 35. 8.2 About the author. Margaret Atwood was born in 1939 in Ottawa and grew up in Northern Ontario, Quebec, and Toronto. She received her undergraduate degree from Victoria College at the University of Toronto and her master's degree from Radcliffe College. The daughter of a forest entomologist, Atwood spent a large part of her childhood in the Canadian wilderness. At the age of 6 she began to write poems, morality plays, comic books, and an unfinished novel about an ant. At 16 she found that writing was, suddenly, the only thing I wanted to do. Throughout her career, Margaret Atwood has received numerous awards. She is the author of more than 30 volumes of poetry, nonfiction, and fiction, including children's books and short stories. Her most recent works include The Handmaid's Tale, 1986, Cat's Eye, 1989, and Alias Grace, 1996, the story collection Good Bones and Simple Murders, 1994, and a volume of poetry, Morning in the Burned House, 1995. Ms. Atwood's work has been published in more than 25 countries. She has traveled extensively and has lived in Boston, Vancouver, Montreal, London, Provence, Berlin, and Edinburgh. Margaret Atwood now lives in Toronto with novelist Graham Gibson and their daughter. 8.3 About the work. The Edible Woman is the first published novel by Margaret Atwood. Rich in metaphor, deliciously comic, and glittering with insight, the story chronicles the fantastic and dramatic ego disintegration of Marion McAlpin, who seems at first to be a perfectly conventional young woman, with friends, a successful and attractive man in her life, and a reasonably good job working for a market research company. Everything in her life seems to fly out of control with her engagement, just as Marion seems ready to fulfill every woman's dream of trading in her troublesome job for marriage and a new life at home with children. The manner of her collapse and the startling ending make for often hilarious reading. This brilliant and witty early work by one of the most admired novelists of our time contains the hallmark themes in the body of work that inspired Vogue magazine to call Atwood one of the most intelligent and talented writers to set herself the task of deciphering life in the late 20th century. 8.4 Summary of the story The Edible Woman. The Edible Woman tells the story of Marion McAlpin, a young single woman who works for a market research company. Unable to foresee a fulfilling career within the company, she begins 36. To worry about her future and about what she might become. One night, she comes to the unsettling realization that her relationship with her boyfriend, Peter, is more serious than she thought it to be. She tries to evade the matter by running away. Yet, when Peter proposes marriage that very night, Marion accepts. She had always assumed that she would get married, and Peter, she thinks, is an ideal choice. He is a lawyer and is bound to be successful. Similarly, Peter feels that marriage will aid his career. Despite her engagement, Marion continues to see Duncan, the aimless graduate student of English literature, whom she met while conducting door-to-door interviews for an ad campaign. The day after Peter proposes, they run into each other at a laundromat where they talk and share an unexpected intimate moment in the form of a kiss. Marion thinks the event is unrelated to Peter. As she watches Peter cut his steak at dinner one night, Marion suddenly visualizes the diagram of a planned cow, outlining all the different cuts of meat. She is unable to finish the steak on her own plate and soon discovers that she can no longer eat meat that has any indication of bone, tendon, or fiber. Before long, the refusal spreads to other foods, leaving her unable to eat many of the things she used to enjoy. She begins to fear that she may not be normal, but her married friend, Clara, assures her that the eating problem is simply a symptom of bridal nerves and that she will soon get over it. As the wedding date approaches, Peter decides to throw a party. He enjoys displaying Marion and hints that she might want to get her hair done and buy a new dress. She complies by buying a red sequined thing that is, she thinks, not quite her. As she walks home, hair heavily scented and every strand glued in place, she thinks of herself as a cake, something to be carefully iced and ornamented. At the party, while Peter prepares to take a group photo, Marion realizes that she must escape. She finds Duncan and the two spend the night together in a hotel. The next morning, she is unable to eat a thing and has no choice but to confront her problems. According to Duncan, Marion's problems are all in her mind. She has invented her own personal cul-de-sac, and will have to think her own way out. Later that afternoon, Marion bakes a cake shaped and decorated into the likeness of a woman. When Peter arrives, she accuses him of trying to assimilate her and offers the cake as a substitute. He leaves quickly, without eating, and Marion begins picking at the cake herself. By the final chapter, Marion has called off the wedding and is eating regularly. Duncan tells her that she is back to so-called reality, a consumer, once again. Marion then watches as Duncan eats the rest of the cake. 37. 8.5 Main characters in the story. Marion McAlpin, a conventional young woman who works in a dull job and is engaged to Peter, a rising young attorney. As the date of her wedding approaches, she loses her appetite, first for red meat and then for all foods. Her behavior becomes increasingly erratic, and at one point she spends a night with Duncan, who seems to be completely unemotional. Marion discovers that she is rebelling against the conventions that have trained her to expect that the best life can offer her is marriage to a financially and socially successful man. The lives of her friends present her with the possible roles of mother, helpmate, companion, and feminist rebel, but she rejects them all. In the end, she breaks her engagement and finds herself alone. Ainsley Tefche, Marion's roommate. She is a radical feminist who decides to have a baby outside marriage and unemotionally chooses Marion's friend Len Slank to be the father. Once pregnant, she panics and decides she must marry, but she rejects Len and chooses an ordinary young man to be her husband. In the end, she blames Marion for rejecting the conventional life. Peter, a rising young attorney. He proposes to Marion because all the young men he had played games with have married and have thus betrayed him. Getting married is the thing to do, everyone else does it, so he might as well. He is thoroughly conventional and wants Marion to be the perfect wife, playing the roles of hostess, mother, and mistress and giving all of her attention to him. He is baffled when Marion's behavior becomes strange, but he offers her no help. Joe and Clara, friends of Marion, a couple who exist for no apparent reason except to reproduce themselves. Joe earns a living and tends the children while Clara happily produces one child after another. They provide a look at one kind of life, one that Marion decides she must reject. Duncan, a young graduate student whom Marion meets at a laundromat and with whom she develops a friendship. Clara Bates. She is a friend of Marion McAlpin. Quite pregnant with her third child as the book begins, she dropped out of college for her first pregnancy. She represents traditional motherhood and sacrifices for one's children. Marion finds Clara rather boring and believes she needs rescuing. Joe Bates. Clara's husband, a college instructor, who does quite a bit of the work at home. He stands for marriage as a way to protect women. 38. Mrs. Bogue. Marion's department head and a prototypical professional woman. Duncan. Marion's love interest, very different than Peter, Marion's fiancé. He is not particularly attractive, not ambitious, and he pushes Marion to be real. Millie, Lucy, and Emmy, the office virgins. They symbolize what is artificial in women's stereotypical roles of the 1960s. Leonard, Shank. A friend of Marion and Clara, a lecherous skirt chaser, according to Marion. Ainsley is trying to trick him into fathering her child, but he is the opposite of the married father, Joe Bates. Fisher, Smythe. Duncan's roommate, who plays a special role near the end in Ainsley's life. Trevor. Duncan's roommate. Trigger. A late marrying friend of Peter's. Peter Wallander. Marion's fiancé, a good catch, who proposes to Marion because it is a sensible thing to do. He wants to mold Marion into his idea of the perfect woman. Woman down below. The landlady, and her child, who represents a kind of strict moral code. 8.6 Summary. From this lesson you learned about one of the most intelligent and talented writers who tried to deciphering life in the late 20th century. You also understood about women and their relationships to men, and to society. 8.7 Check your progress. 1. Where does Marion work? 2. Who is Marion's roommate? 3. What is the job offered to Marion? 4. Who is Duncan in the story? 5. Why does Ainsley want to have a child? 39. 6. What kind of relationship does Peter offer to Marion? 7. Comment on the theme, search for oneself, in the novel The Edible Woman. 8. Is the ending of the novel The Edible Woman satisfactory? 9. In The Edible Woman, how does Margaret Atwood connect food with relationships? Reference. https://www.penguinrandomhouse.com/books/61243-edible-woman-by-margaret-atwood/978000068, Reader's Guide. https://www.encyclopedia.com/art/educational-magazines/edible-woman. 40. Lesson 9. The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, George Ryga, Introduction and Short Summary. Learning Outcome. After reading this lesson, you will get an introduction to the writer George Ryga. You will understood his place in the history of Canadian literature, especially drama. Structure. 9.1 Introduction. 9.2 About the writer. 9.3 About the work, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. 9.4 Short summary of the play. 9.5 Summary. 9.6 Check your progress. 9.1 Introduction. The Athabasca River Basin has produced one significant writer, George Ryga. As a playwright, novelist and poet, he has left an important legacy in Canadian literature. His play, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, is considered to be one of the most important dramas produced in English Canada and is typical of his controversial political views. 9.2 About the writer. George Ryga was born in 1932 in Deep Creek, near Athabasca, Alberta, into a family of Ukrainian immigrants who had arrived in Canada in 1927. In this remote rural community, George grew up speaking Ukrainian and began to learn English when he attended school in a one-room log schoolhouse. At age 13 his formal schooling stopped and Ryga had to work at odd jobs to help. 41. His family's subsistence farming. He took correspondence courses and won a creative writing competition that gave him a scholarship to the Banff Centre for the Arts. Ryga then worked at various jobs in Edmonton, including writing for radio. In 1955 Ryga went to Scotland to study the work of poet, Robert Burns. He continued to write prose and poetry back in Alberta and worked at several jobs. Between 1961 and 62 he worked on his first play, Indian, which came from his experiences working alongside Cree Indians on the farms of Deep Creek. This play was produced in CBC television and launched his writing career. He quickly produced 6 TV plays, short stories for radio and a number of stage plays. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo premiered at the Vancouver Playhouse in 1967 and was the first English-language play put on at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa in 1969. His next play, Grass and Wild Strawberries, 1969, was a great success and included original music from the group Chilliwack. Commissioned by the Vancouver Playhouse, Ryga wrote the political play, Captives of a Faceless Drummer, 1971, which parallels the events of the October Crisis of 1970. The board of directors decided not to produce the play because it was too controversial. The artistic director David Gardner was dismissed and Ryga was given the reputation as too radical. Ryga went on to publish Sunrise for Sarah, 1973, 7 Hours to Sundown, 1977, Plowman of the Glacier, 1977, and 2 plays, Paracelsus and Prometheus Bound, 1982. His last work, In the Shadow of the Vulture, 1985, was also published in the USSR and the Ukraine. In 1987, while Ryga was being nominated for an honorary doctor of Athabasca University, he died of cancer in his home in Summerland, BC. To honor his memory, Athabasca University professor David Gregory published The Athabasca Ryga, 1990, a collection of previously unpublished essays, stories and scripts. Joseph J. Pavato, 2009. 9.3 About the work, The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo recounts the story of a young Indigenous woman who comes to the city to find freedom from the limitations of reserve life, only to experience racism, marginalization, and finally rape and murder. This contemporary tragedy condemns the brutality of a system that limits, rejects, or sentences Indigenous people to lives of social and spiritual poverty, that takes away their pride, their traditions and their language. The death of Rita Jo comes as a consequence of the imposition of a colonizing power on Indigenous peoples. 9.4 Short summary of the play. In The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is tried for vagrancy and prostitution in court by the magistrate, who pretends to be committed to justice and fairness, but who in fact draws on 42. His prejudiced perception of Indigenous peoples in order to condemn Rita for her ability to change her situation. Despite this, Rita and the magistrate connect on a human level as Rita tells him some of her story. As Rita is tried in court, she remembers scenes with loved ones from her life and has visions of other scenes that she was not privy to. Rita loved her sister, father, and Jamie Paul, and she fights to be reunited with them in her memory. Rita is tasked with finding herself character witnesses in 8 hours. The people who come, including her childhood teacher, do nothing to help her situation. Rita is sentenced to 30 days in prison. When she is released, Jamie helps Rita ease back into life. They go to Mr. Homer's shelter but have a struggle with him that leads to her arrest. The magistrate condemns Rita as unhelpable and foreshadows her. Rita is released from prison once again, but it is too late. The murderers kill Jamie when he tries to protect her from them. Then they rape and kill Rita Jo. The last scene of the play is Rita and Jamie's joint funeral. 9.5 Summary. After reading this lesson you understood about the dramatist George Ryga. You also came to understand his position in the field of Canadian drama. You also got an introduction to the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. 9.6 Check your progress. 1. Give a short note on George Ryga, the dramatist. 2. Write a short summary of the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. Reference: http://www.canadiantheatre.com path:/dict.pl. Term equals the %20 Ecstasy %20 of %20 Rita %20 Jo. 43. Lesson 10. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo, ACT 1. Learning outcome. In this lesson you will learn the important events that occur in Act 1 of the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. You will also understand how the Indigenous peoples of Canada were brutalized by white settlers. Structure. 10.1 Introduction. 10.2 About the author. 10.3 About the work. 10.4 Summary of Act 1, Part 1. 10.5 Summary of Act 1 Part 2 The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. 10.6 Summary of The Ecstasy of Rita Jo Act 1 Part 3. 10.7 Summary. 10.8 Check your progress. 10.1 Introduction. The play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is considered to be one of the most important dramas produced in English Canada and is typical of his controversial political views. 10.2 About the author. George Ryga was a Canadian poet, novelist, and playwright, who is considered to be one of the most important Canadian writers of his time. Ryga was the son of two Ukrainian immigrants who arrived in Canada in 1927. He grew up in a remote and rural community near Athabasca, 44, Alberta. He attended school in a one-room log schoolhouse and stopped his formal schooling at age 13 when he started to work odd jobs in order to help support his family. He continued his education through correspondence courses and won a creative writing competition that gave him a scholarship to the Banff Centre for the Arts. Over the course of his career, Ryga developed a reputation for his radical politics. He is the author of 13 published works. 10.3 About the work. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is a play in 2 acts by Canadian playwright George Ryga. It is a play of significant cultural and social importance, which has been used by Indigenous activists as a means of forcing dominant structures to face the reality of prejudice against Indigenous peoples in Canada. The play follows Rita Jo, who moved to the city in pursuit of opportunity, but discovers that she is unable to access the things necessary to live a comfortable life. The play was first performed at the Vancouver Playhouse in November 1967 and was directed by renowned director George Bloomfield. It was the first high-profile Canadian play that addressed the brutality visited upon the Indigenous peoples of Canada by white settlers. The impact of the play is made more effective by its structure, which does not follow a chronological sequence of events, but consists of tableaus presented to show the individual acts of brutality an Indigenous person experienced over the course of their life. Following its initial performances in Vancouver, the play went on to open at the Studio Theatre at the National Arts Centre in 1969. It has also been adapted to be performed in other genres, including a ballet by the Royal Winnipeg Ballet Company. It has also been translated into French and performed across the province of Quebec. 10.4 Summary of Act 1, Part 1. The play opens on a circular ramp, beginning at floor-level stage left and continuing downward below floor level at stage front, then rising and sweeping along stage back at 2-foot elevation to disappear in the wings of stage left. This ramp dominates the stage. Within the ramp lie the magistrate's chair and desk. Next to the desk, turned away from the focus of the play, sits the singer. It is established that she will act as a foil, or alter ego, for Rita Jo throughout the play. Backstage, there is a mountain cyclorama, a panoramic image that wraps around the interior of the ramp. In front of it is a dark curtain, to suggest gloom and confusion, and an image of 45. The city. Before the play starts, the entire cast enters from backstage, the doors of the theater, and the wings from the stage. At the moment that they are all on stage together they pause, and the lights dim. The magistrate enters and the clerk announces that court is in session. The cast chants Rita Joe's name as she is brought on stage by the policeman. The magistrate discusses the nature of the law as the cast leaves the stage. He states that freedom is a function of the law. Rita, with humor, almost a sad sigh, tells of a time she was tricked into arrest by a group of men. She follows this up with, "It wasn't true what they said, but nobody'd believe me." The magistrate speaks of the law and the importance of a strong economy. Rita realizes that the magistrate does not relate to her, so she turns to the audience to tell of the job she once had, working in a tire store. Jamie Paul enters. He is jubilant, and Rita runs to him. This is a memory. He tells Rita about the things he saw in the city. Rita accompanies his story with what she has heard of the city, that in the morning clouds are red over the city, and, if you're real happy, the clouds make you forget you're not home. Jamie tells Rita that he was singing, but that the people in the city were watching him like he was a harbor seal, so he stopped. Rita tells Jamie that she remembers colors, but has already forgotten faces. The magistrate asks for her attention, and she tells Jamie that they are going to put her in jail again. He does not follow her, and as he leaves the stage and ends the memory he tells Rita of the room he is renting, and how he is going to buy a car so that he can take her everywhere. He leaves, and the court is back in session. The magistrate charges Rita with vagrancy. Rita tells him of her previous night in jail. He asks if she has appeared before him in the last year, to which Rita responds that she doesn't know. This makes the magistrate and the policeman laugh. The magistrate tells Rita she will have to find witnesses for herself, and that she has 8 hours to do so. 10.5 Summary of Act 1 Part 2 The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. The magistrate reads the policeman's report, in which 2 undercover policemen approached Rita and, through entrapment, arrested her for prostitution. Rita is defiant, and she responds, "That's a goddamned lie." She tells her side of the story. She was driving home when she saw the 2 policemen. She knew they were cops, and told them to go, fly a kite. In response to 46. This, the policemen began to push her around. They followed her until a 3rd cop arrived, at which time she was arrested. Once in the back of their car, they stuffed $5 bills in my pocket. The magistrate becomes irritated and tells Rita that she needs to find witnesses to substantiate her claims. The policeman exits. The magistrate once again asks Rita about the child he saw on the side of the road. Rita denies knowing the child. The magistrate tells Rita that he has 2 sons, who are free to do whatever they wish, but if he had a girl, he would be concerned about her choices. These things don't come as lightly for a girl. He then tells Rita to stop hiding her child, as someone else can be found to raise her if you can't. Rita tells him she would sooner kill her child than let it be taken away. Rita wants to go home. She has another memory, and Jamie, the young Indian men, Eileen, and an old woman enter the stage. They are welcoming Jamie back home from the north. Eileen tells Rita that she broke up with her fiancé. All but the young Indian men leave, and Rita rushes to stand with them. She attempts to connect with the men, but they don't remember her. The 3 murderers enter the stage and stand up stage. One of the murderers steps forward as a witness. He tells the magistrate about how he gave Rita $3 for sex, and slapped her around. As the witness gives his testimony, Rita continues to attempt to connect with the young Indian men. She is longing for a time long gone. "I wish we could go back again and start livin' from that day on." Jamie reappears. Another one of the murderers testifies as a witness. He tells the magistrate that he paid Rita $5 for sex and that she was scared. He also says that she told him she wished she was a school teacher, and everyone on stage laughs. Jamie and Rita lie down and embrace. They hold each other as Rita remembers a moment of intimacy in a cemetery. He leaves and the policeman returns. The magistrate charges Rita Jo with stealing. He tells her it is the 7th charge against her in 1 year. Rita tells him she was hungry and had no money. They go over Rita's personal history. The policeman tells the magistrate she was disruptive in school. Rita Jo tells a story of when she was in school and a boy accused her of having her horse step on him on purpose. She calls this a lie. The policeman and the singer laugh, and the magistrate asks her, why should they lie, and Rita Jo alone tell the truth. He tells Rita not to blame the police. The obstacles to your life are here, in your thoughts, possibly even in your culture. 47. He tells Rita that she has to change herself and conform to the accepted white standards. There is no peace in being extraordinary. 10.6 Summary of the Ecstasy of Rita Jo Act 1 Part 3. Rita is transported to another memory. Jamie and the 4 young Indian men and Mr. Homer enter. Mr. Homer is distributing soup to them. He tells the audience, the do-gooders make something special of the Indian, there's nothing special here. Jamie becomes agitated and approaches Mr. Homer. He tells Mr. Homer that he spits in his soup. He then tells Mr. Homer that he saw him down by Rainbow Creek. Mr. Homer denies ever having been. They exit. Rita returns to the magistrate and the singer. Rita, happy and acting drunk, tells the magistrate a story. She tells of staring up at the stars and seeing her grandfather, and calling the chief and telling him she saw God in the sky. Suddenly, Rita becomes aware of her captivity. She asks him what her sentence will be. She is afraid. The magistrate tells her he has no alternative in sentencing her. She begs him to let her go and tells him that she will go home and find a job. He tells her that she might be an incurable carrier, that she might be the kind of person that cannot come into contact with others without infecting them. After this condemnation, he exits. Rita falls to the floor. The light comes up in the backstage and shows Eileen and an old woman, miming washing clothes, as well as Jamie and a policeman. The policeman is scolding Jamie for being drunk, abusive, and noisy. Jamie shows the policeman a coin trick. The old woman and Eileen discuss Eileen's father, David, who has been sick. The old woman wonders if Rita will be able to say goodbye to him. Rita, calling from her world to the world of her strongest fears, denies that David is dying. They can't hear her. Rita didn't know her father was sick. All but Rita and Eileen exit. The teacher enters, and she scolds Rita for making the class wait. She and Eileen sit with the other children. The teacher asks Rita what a melting pot is. She does not know. The teacher has Rita recite a verse from the Bible. The teacher tells Rita that she will never make bronze, that is, she will never be a successful addition to the melting pot, coming from nowhere and going no place. Who am I to change that? The teacher and the other schoolchildren exit. Rita is alone on stage for the first time. Rita reveals that she has spent 7.5 hours looking for a character witness, but she has not been able to find one. David and Jamie enter. They are discussing business, and 48. Jamie tells David that it is time to stop relying on handouts. David tells Jamie that it is not good to be as angry as he is. Jamie exits and leaves Rita with her father. Rita's father faces away from her and tells her that she left him and that he is dead. They discuss their dreams. They dream about each other. They sit together as Rita asks for a story from her childhood. The magistrate enters to ask Rita when the last time she had an appointment at a dentist's office was. Rita covers her ears, reluctant to give up her time with her father. He continues to ask her questions. The teacher emerges, and refuses to testify to Rita's good character. Mr. Homer enters and tells the magistrate that she assaulted him one night. Jamie enters and Rita pleads for a good word from him. He tells her he was fired and asks, "What the hell's the use of living?" The school board clerk enters to offer testimony and tells the magistrate that he sent Rita a letter recommending she continue her schooling through correspondence courses, but that Rita never replied. Rita told him that her boss used to burn their mail, but the clerk replies that she never replied to the letter. The testimonies continue to come. They become a nightmare babble. The murderers appear and circle Rita while listing out her charges. Rita pleads with them all. "You got rules here that was made before I was born." The murderers come closer as the magistrate asks her whether she has been checked for diseases by a doctor recently. Rita breaks away from the murderers and tells the magistrate to put her in jail. She is sentenced to 30 days. 10.7 Summary. From this lesson you understood the main events that occurred in Act 1 of the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. You also understood how the indigenous people of Canada were brutalized by white settlers. 10.8 Check your progress. 1. Why does Rita Jo move to the city? 2. What does Rita want to become? 3. Sum up the important incidents in Act 1 of the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. 49. Lesson 11. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo, ACT 2. Learning Outcome. After reading this lesson, you will get an introduction to the writer George Ryga. You will understood his place in the history of Canadian literature, especially drama. Structure. 11.1 Introduction. 11.2 About the author. 11.3 About the work. 11.4 Main incidents in Act 2. 11.5 Main incidents in Act 2 Part 2. 11.6 Summary. 11.7 Check your progress. 1.1 Introduction. The play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is considered to be one of the most important dramas produced in English Canada and is typical of his controversial political views. 11.2 About the author. George Ryga was a Canadian poet, novelist, and playwright, who is considered to be one of the most important Canadian writers of his time. Ryga was the son of two Ukrainian immigrants who arrived in Canada in 1927. Over the course of his career, Ryga developed a reputation for his radical politics. 50. 11.3 About the work. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is a play in 2 acts by Canadian playwright George Ryga. It is a play of significant cultural and social importance, which has been used by Indigenous activists as a means of forcing dominant structures to face the reality of prejudice against Indigenous peoples in Canada. The play follows Rita Jo, who moved to the city in pursuit of opportunity, but discovers that she is unable to access the things necessary to live a comfortable life. It was the first high-profile Canadian play that addressed the brutality visited upon the Indigenous peoples of Canada by white settlers. The impact of the play is made more effective by its structure, which does not follow a chronological sequence of events, but consists of tableaus presented to show the individual acts of brutality an Indigenous person experienced over the course of their life. 11.4 Main incidents in Act 2. A policeman brings Rita into her jail cell, where she curls up and sleeps. David enters and crosses down to the audience. The division between the two actors is accentuated by the lights. David looks at her and remembers how the last time Rita came home to visit, he watched her leave, and "My heart got so heavy I wanted to cry." David exits as she wakes. The priest and the policeman enter, and the priest pauses at the edge of Rita's cell. He passes her a pack of cigarettes and apologizes for her situation. The priest is sad about Rita's situation, and struggles with himself. The priest empathizes with Rita but still sure of her sins, telling her, "Our Lord Jesus once met a woman such as you beside the well. He forgave her." Rita tells him she feels as though no one hears her, to which he responds, "I'm here." Conflict emerges between them about the church, and Rita tells the priest that her uncle told her that the church was a conduit of colonization for white people. The priest asks Rita to confess, but all Rita wants is to be free. The priest tells her there is freedom in Christianity. "We learn through suffering, Rita Jo. We will only be free if we become humble again." Rita curses him, saying, "Go tell your God, when you see him." Tell him about Rita Jo and what they done to her. The priest exits. Jamie enters and tells her that he will take her dancing on Friday. They dance. The 4 young Indian men enter and join them in their dancing. The murderers follow and are fought away. All but Rita and Jamie exit. They continue to dance. The young Indian men return, wheeling in a brass bed. They exit. Jamie takes Rita's hand and leads her away. They walk across the stage. 51. As if they were traveling to Jamie's room and approach the brass bed. Rita sits on it, and Jamie offers her some chocolate. Jamie tells her of his plans of going to a beer parlor and resisting getting thrown out by its racist proprietors. This is one Indian guy they're not pushing around no more. Rita tells him that their friend in the city had both her children taken away. Jamie tells her that her father is the kind of Indian a white man likes, and that he would wait forever, for the kids they take away to come back. Rita tells Jamie that her father is scared and so is she. Jamie tells Rita sometimes he wants to kill himself. He tells her he gets scared sometimes too. They laugh at the absurdity of white people, how they can never know what white people want from them, how they could never ask what they want from white people. They get up, and the lights dim on them. David and the priest enter. The priest tells David that she got out of jail, but that she won't let him see her. David tells the priest he should enter the city to visit his daughter. The lights go down on them. The young Indian men and Mr. Homer enter. Mr. Homer empties a clothing hamper onto a table. Rita Jo rummages through the clothes on the table. Jamie has a conversation with the young Indian men. Jamie is in a provocative mood, and fights with one of the young Indian men. He talks about being his own boss and makes jokes about the sweater Rita picks out for herself. Jamie becomes grim. He tells them that Mr. Homer has no children except for them and that he intends on keeping them as children. He tells them they should become men, that he is a big boy now. Mr. Homer offers them all some food, and Jamie and Rita decline. 11.5 Main incidents in Act 2 Part 2. Jamie and Rita share a cigarette. David and the priest enter. They have been fighting. The conversations between Rita and Jamie and David and the priest weave together. Rita and Jamie discuss how laughter changes white people's perception of him. The priest and Rita's father discuss Rita and Jamie. Rita's father wants to give up being the chief to someone more educated than he is. If we only fish and hunt and cut pulpwood, for 100 years more, we are dead. Jamie tells Mr. Homer, who is still feeding the young Indian men sandwiches, that he once went 5 days without food. Still, he rejects Mr. Homer's sandwich. Rita tells Jamie that Mr. 52. Homer doesn't know what happened, to which Jamie responds, "Sure he knows. He's feedin' sandwiches to Indian bums. He knows. He's the worst kind." Mr. Homer threatens to throw him out of the facility. Rita returns the red sweater she had tried on and sides with Jamie when questioned by Mr. Homer. Mr. Homer moves to get everyone to leave, but Jamie resists. Mr. Homer chases him with the knife he was using to prepare sandwiches, but is shocked when it is pointed out to him that the knife is still in his hand. Jamie throws over the table and he and the young Indian men begin to throw clothing over the ramp. Rita attempts to stop all of this to no avail. Mr. Homer reaches a boiling point. He insults both Jamie and Rita Jo and pushes Rita hard. Rita snaps and attacks him, and he runs away. Soon, the police arrive and take all 6 people out of the building. As he is carried away, Jamie yells defiantly at the audience, "Not just a box of cornflakes. When I go in I want the whole store." Jamie is taken before the magistrate, who sentences him to 30 days in jail. He demands that his truth be acknowledged. "Teach me who I really am. You've taken that away. Give me back the real me so I can live like a man." The magistrate responds that there is room for dialogue, but only within the framework of institutions and traditions in existence for that purpose. Jamie does not accept this response. The magistrate exits and Jamie is led away by a policeman. Rita enters, followed by her father and Jamie. David tells her he has come to bring her home. Jamie does not want her to go. They argue about her as she worriedly looks between the two of them. Then all three argue about politics. David tells of a dragonfly with a broken shell. Jamie dialogues with David as a representative of an older generation, and he asserts that change can only happen through fighting. They all say goodbye, and Rita's father leaves. Jamie also leaves, and Rita chooses not to follow. The magistrate enters. He sentences Rita to 30 days in prison. He tells her that she will be back. The magistrate delivers a monologue about the inevitability of their position, all the while justifying the actions of the colonizers. We came up as a civilization having to, yes, claw upwards at times. There's nothing wrong with that. He claims that those services offered to Aboriginal peoples in Canada aren't taken advantage of, such as schools and health services. He claims that they don't keep jobs, your reliability record is ruined and an employer has to regard you as lazy, undependable, and that they purposefully migrate to working-class neighborhoods in the cities. His message is clear: you Indians seem to be incapable of taking action to help yourselves. Before he exits, he warns Rita that her days are numbered. 53. The murderers appear on stage. As Rita runs away from them, she runs into Jamie. He tells her they will go eat and watch a movie. The murderers attack Jamie. Jamie dies. The murderers attack Rita. She dies. Rita's father enters carrying Jamie's body. He is surrounded by mourners. They place his body next to Rita's. They all kneel around the two bodies. 11.6 Summary. From this lesson you understood the main events that occurred in Act 1 of the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. You also understood how the Indigenous people of Canada were brutalized by white settlers. 11.7 Check your progress. 1. Why is Rita Jo sentenced for a variety of crimes over the course of the play? 2. What do the tensions between Rita's father and Jamie tell of the political climate of the 1970s? 3. Are the white characters aware of their own prejudice? Do they justify thinking the way that they do? 4. Comment on the sad ending of Rita Jo. Reference: https://www.gradesaver.com/the-ecstasy-of-rita-jo/study-guide/p-79-101. 54. Lesson 11. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo, Characters and Themes. Learning Outcome. After reading this lesson, you will get an introduction to the writer George Ryga. You will understood his place in the history of Canadian literature, especially drama. Structure. 12.1 Introduction. 12.2 About the author. 12.3 About the work. 12.4 Important characters in the play. 12.5 Important themes in the play. 12.6 Summary. 12.7 Check your progress. 12.1 Introduction. The play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is considered to be one of the most important dramas produced in English Canada and is typical of his controversial political views. 12.2 About the author. George Ryga was a Canadian poet, novelist, and playwright, who is considered to be one of the most important Canadian writers of his time. Ryga was the son of two Ukrainian immigrants who arrived in Canada in 1927. 55. 12.3 About the work. The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is a play in 2 acts by Canadian playwright George Ryga. It is a play of significant cultural and social importance, which has been used by Indigenous activists as a means of forcing dominant structures to face the reality of prejudice against Indigenous peoples in Canada. The play follows Rita Jo, who moved to the city in pursuit of opportunity, but discovers that she is unable to access the things necessary to live a comfortable life. It was the first high-profile Canadian play that addressed the brutality visited upon the Indigenous peoples of Canada by white settlers. The impact of the play is made more effective by its structure, which does not follow a chronological sequence of events, but consists of tableaus presented to show the individual acts of brutality an indigenous person experienced over the course of their life. 12.4 Important characters in the play. 1. Rita Jo. A young and poor indigenous woman, Rita Jo is the protagonist of the play. She comes to the city from the reservation where she grew up, seeking a better life. Rita loves her father, sister and Jamie Paul, and she calls upon memories of her loved one when she is in difficult situations. Rita Jo represents the indigenous person in a colonized nation, demonized, degraded, and misunderstood. Rita loses her job and falls into a series of arrests for various crimes. Her story is consistently doubted by those in power. At the end of the play, Rita is killed. 2. Jamie Paul. Jamie Paul is a young indigenous man and lifelong friend of Rita Jo. He comes to the city with high hopes, but he eventually loses his job and takes to drinking. He lives in poverty, but self-respect keeps him from accepting charity. He fights back against marginalization and is angered by the discrimination he experiences. Jamie Paul demands equal opportunities to those enjoyed by white men, but he too is marginalized and his voice is suppressed in the same way as Rita Jo's. He dies while trying to save Rita's life. 3. David Jo. David Jo is Rita's father. He is a man who accepts the various aspects of colonization easily. He moves to the reservation they are given, and also tries to persuade Rita Jo to return to the 56 reservation, as he knows the dangers of being alone in the city. He never rebels against the colonizers and accepts all the injustices he faces in silence. He is, as Jamie Paul describes him, the kind of Indian a white man likes. 4. Magistrate. The magistrate is the person who hears Rita Jo's case. He is not given a name, which shows that he is not one person, but rather represents the whole of the law-giving body in a colonized nation. When Rita Jo first appears before him in court, he expresses his will to be just and fair to her, but he does not understand or relate to her, making him distrust her and in turn making him give her an unjust sentence more than once. 5. Father Andrew. Father Andrew is a priest who works among the indigenous people on the reservation. He visits Rita Jo in jail, and there tries to get a confession out of her. He keeps trying to thrust Christianity onto the natives. Even at the end, when Rita Jo and Jamie Paul die, he barges into the funeral to recite his prayers. He represents the role of religion in the process of colonization. 6. Miss Donahue. Miss Donahue is Rita Jo's schoolteacher. She is a white woman and is not able to understand Rita Jo. She finds Rita a trying student when young. She appears in court as a witness for Rita Jo, but she doesn't have much an opinion about her and believes that she is a prostitute. 7. Singer. The singer is an alter ego of Rita Jo. She acts as a kind of a chorus to the play, trying to fill the gaps in the play. The singer is used to portray the native perspective of things. She often sings the line, "God was gonna have a laugh," and "gave me a job in the city," which summarizes the whole of the play. 12.5 Important themes in the play. 1. Colonization. A central theme of the play The Ecstasy of Rita Jo is colonization, as Indigenous peoples in Canada still suffer effects of the colonization of their lands from hundreds of years before. Rita Jo does not receive justice because the colonizers cannot understand anything about her. 57. Because they don't listen to her testimony when she provides it, and because they have little impetus to look beyond stereotype and prejudice when interacting with Indigenous peoples. Not being able to understand her, they destroy her along with her friends and family, and condemn her as a threat to the order of society, because her truth threatens the very system upon which their society is built. 2. Cultural assimilation. Assimilation is a process through which individuals or groups of different heritages or cultures are absorbed into the dominant culture. In the play, the pressure to assimilate is embodied by Miss Donahue, Rita's teacher, who scolds Rita on her ability to melt herself down into the melting pot. The magistrate also pressures Rita to assimilate, telling her, there is no peace in being extraordinary. Pressures to assimilate are often pressures to submit more readily to a dominant class. The white people in Rita's life who told her to give up the parts of herself that differ from the general population were not doing so for her good, but for the good of their own privilege. 3. Economic empowerment. The economic struggles of Indigenous peoples in Canada is a recurring theme of the play, as well the main source of disagreement between Jamie and David Jo. Jamie and David Jo both know that the situation of the Indigenous person in Canada must improve, because their community will not survive as it is for much longer. Indigenous peoples were shut out of the economic marketplace. They were stuck on lands that were mostly infertile and in communities that held few prospects for economic growth. When they attempted to move into the city for the opportunities it offered the white population, they faced poverty, joblessness, and eventually, in the case of Rita Jo, death. 4. Incarceration. Incarceration, and the connections of this condition to class and race, emerges as a central theme of the play. The way in which the state deals with Rita's poverty is by incarcerating her, rather than through social programs that might have taken her out of the condition that pushed her to crime. Over the course of the play, Rita is continually punished for crimes that she may or may not have actually committed. She is stripped of her freedom in many ways that others in her situation would not have been. She is punished for doing what she can to survive. 58. 5. Pride. Jamie is often accused of being too prideful because he will not accept Mr. Homer's offerings and he refuses to accept discrimination from the bar that he wants to go to with his friends. At the same time, Jamie advocates for dispensing of pride that has kept his community silent, indicated in his fight with David Jo. They're looking for Indians that stay proud even when they hurt. Just so long as they don't ask for their rights. 113. At the end of the play, Jamie is murdered for attempting to save Rita Jo from her fate. Through the character of Jamie, Ryga illuminates the societal penalization of pride in members of the community it works to marginalize. 6. Hope, Ascension. Rita Jo's story is a tragedy that offers no clear message of hope about the situation of the Indigenous person in 1960s Canada. In many ways, the Indigenous characters of this play are desperately searching for something to hope for, but they cannot find it. Eileen hopes for a man she can believe in, Jamie hopes for respect, David Jo hopes for his daughter to come home. At Rita's funeral, the white structure is finally subverted as Eileen silences the white mourners in order to give her own testimony about her sister's life. In telling the white mourners no more, the play ends on a slightly more hopeful message of testimony beyond the white narrative. We are reminded of the audience of the Vancouver Playhouse when this play was put on, which was mostly white and middle class, and the play itself can be reframed as a testimony and an agent for change. 12.6 Summary. After reading this lesson you understood how the Indigenous people of Canada suffered in the hands of the settlers. 12.7. Check your progress. Role of Ms. Donahue in the play. Sketch the character of Rita Jo. Comment on the theme of colonization in the play? References. https://www.gradesavor.com/the-ecstasy-of-rita-jo/study-guide/themes. 59. Lesson 13. Face by Alice Munro. Learning outcomes. From this lesson you will understand the complex and ambiguous nature of human beings. You will also learn how a defect leads to a lot of discrimination. Structure. 13.1 Introduction. 13.2 About the author. 13.3 About the work. 13.4 Main ideas in the story. 13.5 Important question and answers. 13.6 Summary. 13.7 Check your progress. 13.1 Introduction. The unnamed narrator of Alice Munro's story is born with a birthmark covering almost the entirety of one side of his face. He faces a lot of hatred from his own father due to this defect. 13.2 About the author. Alice Munro is a renowned Canadian short story writer who recently won the Nobel Prize in Literature. The fluidity of her works is said to have been a path-breaking form in the legacy of short story writing, having transformed the way short stories are written. Her dismissal of a linear narrative to adopt a more complex sense of structure has earned her the admiration and devotion of her fans. 60. These short stories depict the complex and ambiguous nature of human beings in a simple but distinct form that has made her a revolutionary in the realm of short story fiction. This complexity arises in the form of the unreliability of the narrator in Menacitong, in which one has to rely on external sources to grasp the facts of the story. 13.3 About the work. In Face, Alice Munro makes one of her particular detours into the past to contemplate on the present. She focuses on the intricate effects that a childhood event can have on adult life. 13.4 Main ideas in the story. The story begins with a father's dramatic rejection of his newly born son because of a birthmark covering the right side of the baby's face. The boy grows up facing the extreme polarity of his father's resentment and his mother's devotion. However, this potential psychological trauma is not the focus of the narrative. As the story progresses, the narrator gives a rather standoffish tale of his whole life, which appears to be an ordinary life of an actor. Yet, the dramatic turn in the story does not involve anything from his family life, nor his career. The narrative energy is concentrated in a freakish event that occurs in the middle of a serious game acted out with a neighbor playmate. Even though the boy does not understand the full meaning of this event, it has a remarkable significance for him as an adult. Munro uses emotionally restrained language to deal with heartbreaking revelations. For long temporal stretches, the story is restricted to the surface details of things, but when the narrator starts talking about the event, what he has come to think of as the great drama of his life, he becomes vulnerable to his own romantic interpretation of it, and even to an excessive dramatization. Since this is ultimately a story about the possibility of love, Munro balances the implausible illusion of being destined for a romantic love with the uncanny and uncontrollable accidents, which pattern behavior with a strong sense of fate. The story is retrospective. A boy was born with a birthmark, a port wine stain, covering half his face. The mark reveals, but probably didn't cause, his father's meanness. In any case, there is little further contact between father and son, even though the father remains in the home. There is a bond with his mother, though, and the reader might suspect that the unnatural bond would be central to the story, but in fact the narrator has a more or less natural existence. He's lonely, in large part because of the birthmark, but he's otherwise normal. The retrospection dwells for the most part on Nancy, the neighbor girl, who was his best friend and constant playmate, until the day she painted her face red, horrifying the boy with an idea of how the 61 world must see him. The incident probably could have been smoothed over by the parents, but they only make it worse, and so it sticks in the mind of the boy and, as later events show, the girl. But all that is there in the past of the story. There is also action in the present. The narrator, while gardening, is stung on the eyelid by a wasp. He manages to drive himself to the hospital, but is kept overnight because his eyes are bandaged, to prevent strain, and while he is in bed he is visited by someone who offers to read to him. Or is he? In fact, it seems, he's having a dream, in which he is able to recite volumes of poetry, which, since he was a radio actor, maybe he would be able to do, but it seemed like fantasy to me, including specific lines that he cannot identify when he wakes. Somewhat by accident he discovers in his father's books a handwritten copy of the poem from which the lines came, a piece by Walter de la Mare, and not only is the whole poem appropriate to the vision he had in the hospital, but de la Mare's work in general seems to be also. In regards to the birthmark, the narrator says, "My birthmark not red but purple. Dark in my infancy and early childhood, fading somewhat as I got older, but never fading to a state of inconsequence, never ceasing to be the first thing people noticed about me, head on, never ceasing to shock those who had come at me from the left side. The narrator paints the image of an eye-catching birthmark on the left-hand side of the face that is highly perceptible. 13.5 Important question and answers. A. What are the main agents that influence the narrator's perception of the birthmark? Face. Family. The narrator's mother helps him to accept the birthmark as something that is standard. However, his father disliked the narrator intensely due to the birthmark. Friends. The narrator's childhood friend, Nancy, hurts him ruthlessly when she colors her face so that her cheek can be like the narrator's. Nancy's imitation triggers an explosive reaction which changes the courses of their lives. School. At school, the narrator is nicknamed Grapenuts. The nickname is label that makes the narrator conscious of his birthmark. Neighbours. Sharon Suttles discriminates against the narrator. In a confrontation, Sharon Suttles tells the narrator's mother, "Can I help it if your husband hates you and you got a kid with a messed up face?" Sharon Suttles' assertion discomforts the narrator's ego. 62. B. What is the irony in the title, His Grace? Face. The narrator's mother referred to her husband as His Grace. This title is ironic considering that the narrator's father is a graceless person who neither appreciates his son nor his wife. Instead of loving him, he hurts them through his insensitive behavior. Besides, the narrator acknowledges that his father was unreceptive of him when he was born. C. What defense does the narrator's mother employ after the confrontation with Sharon Suttles? Face. The narrator's mother employs sublimation. She tells Velma, "Fetch me my garden shears, would you, Velma? While I'm out here, I might as well trim the glads." Some of them are downright wilted. After getting the shears, she cuts down all the glads. Through the sublimation, she turns her anger, stemming from Sharon's spiteful remarks, to pruning the glads. D. How would you apply the Lacanian psychoanalysis to interpret the narrator's mother's old days? Face. The narrator says, "My mother changed completely in her old age, becoming ribald and fanciful. She claimed that my father had been a magnificent lover and that she herself had been a pretty bad girl." According to Lacanian psychoanalysis, the narrator's mother is living in imaginary order. The assertion that her husband was a magnificent lover is an illusion of what she would have wanted while her husband was still alive. Furthermore, the fancies of being bad girl imply that she has misgivings for being a good girl, yet the goodness did not make her happy. Therefore, she hides in the imaginary order to block the symbolic order that she has dominated her entire life. 13.6 Summary. After reading the lesson, you will understand the complex and ambiguous nature of human beings. You will also get a glimpse into how defects in appearance lead to a lot of discrimination in the world. 13.7 Check your progress. 1. How does the narrator suffer because of the birthmark on his face? 2. Comment on the aptness of the title face. 3. What kind of relationship does the boy share with his father in face? 63. References. https://www.gradesaver.com/alice-munro-short-stories/study-guide/essay-questions. http://www.buriedinprint.com/face-alice-munro/ https://academy/answers/r-there-any-allusions-in-face-by-alice-munro.html. 64. Lesson 14. The Hostelry of Mr. Smith, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, Stephen. Leacock. Learning Outcomes. From this lesson you will understand the position held by Stephen Leacock among the galaxy of writers. Why this work has remained popular till today. What is the universal appeal the writer holds over the readers? Structure. 14.1 Introduction. 14.2 About the author. 14.3 About the work. 14.4 Main ideas in the story. 14.5 Summary. 14.6 Check your progress. 14.1 Introduction. Leacock was undoubtedly inspired by Twain, whom he admired greatly. But the writing style is different. The humor is different. The stories are much different. Leacock just felt a hankering to write about the characters who inhabit small Canadian towns. 14.2 About the author. Stephen P. H. Butler Leacock FRSC, the 30th of December 1869 to 28 March 1944, was a Canadian teacher, political scientist, writer, and humorist. Between the years 1915 and 1925, he was 65. The best-known English-speaking humorist in the world. He is known for his light humor along with criticisms of people's follies. 14.3 About the work. Stephen Leacock's Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, 1912, is a sequence of short stories or vignettes about the people that populate a small town. In Sunshine Sketches, the fictional little town is Mariposa on the shore of Lake Wissanotti. Leacock resisted efforts to tie Mariposa to his time in Orillia, Ontario, noting, "Mariposa is not a real town. On the contrary, it is about 70 or 80 of them. You may find them all the way from Lake Superior to the sea, with the same square streets and the same maple trees and the same churches and hotels. The work is populated with timeless archetypes of small towns, treated carefully with affection and humor. Modern readers will be reminded of Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon from Prairie Home Companion. The sinking of the steamboat Mariposa Belle, featuring one of the smartest pieces of rescue work ever seen on the lake, is one of the best loved and most admired vignettes in Sunshine Sketches. 14.4 Main ideas in the story. Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town is a sequence of stories by Stephen Leacock, first published in 1912. It is generally considered to be one of the most enduring classics of Canadian humorous literature. The fictional setting for these stories is Mariposa, a small town on the shore of Lake Wissanotti. Although drawn from his experiences in Orillia, Ontario, Leacock notes, "Mariposa is not a real town. On the contrary, it is about 70 or 80 of them. You may find them all the way from Lake Superior to the sea, with the same square streets and the same maple trees and the same churches and hotels." This work has remained popular for its universal appeal. Many of the characters, though modeled on townspeople of Orillia, are small-town archetypes. Their shortcomings and weaknesses are presented in a humorous but affectionate way. Often, the narrator exaggerates the importance of the events in Mariposa compared to the rest of the world. For example, when there is a country-wide election, the town of Mariposa was, of course, the storm center and focus point of the whole turmoil. 66. The story of the steamboat Mariposa Belle sinking in Lake Wissanotti is one of the best loved in the set. The apparent magnitude of this accident is lessened somewhat when it is revealed that the depth of the water is less than 6 feet. Men from the town come to the rescue in an unseaworthy lifeboat which sinks beneath them just as they are pulled onto the steamer, and the narrator earnestly remarks that this was one of the smartest pieces of rescue work ever seen on the lake. This story is about Mr. Smith, who is a hotel and a bar owner. One day he accidentally locks out Judge Pepperley and McCartney outside one-to-many times. Now these are two of the people who have the right to give and to take away others' bar licenses, so they threaten to take away his bar license. Since Mr. Smith was not pleased, so he decided that he would change his hotel to be like one that is in the cities. This included an addition of an underground dining room with no windows, a French chief in a French café, and a girls' room. The public was pleased with these additions, so they thought that taking Mr. Smith's bar license was unfair, so they made a petition that was signed by practically the whole town. Because of this petition, Judge Pepperley and McCartney decided to drop the charges, otherwise they would have a whole town appraising. Leacock was undoubtedly inspired by Twain, whom he admired greatly. But the writing style is different. The humor is different. The stories are much different. Firstly, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town delivers on its title. It is a series of sketches, short stories, that overall give a picture of the town. Apparently Leacock kept striving to write novels, but despite his efforts his books remained, at best, linked and overlapping stories. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Leacock's sensibility is perfect for stories. He's not after a large statement about life and society or the development of some individual through a life-changing series of adventures and crises. In fact, it's important his characters don't develop much, for he's giving a picture of human nature frozen in a certain time and place, saying, "See, how like us all this is." Mariposa gives him a small, controlled laboratory removed from the rest of the world for his delving into human nature. In Sunshine Sketches Leacock is a character himself throughout. Not a character with a name or role in the action. But as narrator he's one of the townspeople who has left Mariposa, yet still visits, and when he does visit, even if just in imagination, he's one of them again. He shares the townspeople's enthusiasms, their delusions and their disappointments. 67. 14.5 Summary. After reading this lesson you understood why Stephen Leacock holds such a vantage position among the galaxy of writers. You also understood why this work has remained popular till today and what is the universal appeal the writer holds over the readers. 14.6 Check your progress. 1. How did Mr. Smith get the idea of starting a cafe? 2. Who were the regular customers at the hotel? 3. For what reason did Mr. Smith lose his license? 4. Who were Henry Mullins and George Duff? 5. Write an essay on Mariposa as a microcosm of early life in Canada. References. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/sunshine_of_a_little_town. 68. Lesson 15. Cannibal Woman, Ron Geyshick. Learning outcome. From this lesson you will understand the position held by Ron Geyshick among the galaxy of writers. Why this work has remained popular till today. What is the universal appeal the writer holds over the readers? Structure. 15.1 Introduction. 15.2 About the author. 15.3 About the work. 15.4 Main points in the story. 15.5 Short summary of the story Cannibal Woman. 15.6 Summary. 15.7 Check your progress. 15.1 Introduction. In the story the cannibal woman Ron Geyshick is exploring the bizarre problem of cannibalism. 15.2 About the author. Ron Geyshick, 1942, is an Ojibwe healer and storyteller from Lac La Croix, Ontario. Several of Ron Geyshick's stories from Autobiography are included in an anthology of Canadian Native literature in English, edited by Daniel David Moses, Terry Goldie and Armand Garnet Ruffo, 1990. 69. 15.3 About the work. Cannibal Woman is a story to be found in Autobiography, Truth, a collection of stories by Ron Geyshick. Autobiography, Truth, is a pioneering work of Ojibwe literature. By turns haunting, humorous, fantastic and powerful, the stories in this collection explore the traditional spiritual world of the Ojibwe, as experienced by Ron Geyshick, a healer and guide from the Lac La Croix Reserve in a remote part of northern Ontario. Judith Doyle has collected these stories of Ron Geyshick, an Ojibwe healer. 15.4 Main points in the story. In the story the cannibal woman Ron Geyshick is exploring the bizarre problem of cannibalism. The Wetiko psychosis, a bizarre form of mental disorder involving obsessive cannibalism, has been reported by many investigators for the area between Lake Winnipeg and Labrador. The illness is associated mainly with the Cree and Ojibwe Indians who inhabit Canada's forested northland. Although this mental disturbance has been reported for both sexes, it usually afflicts males who have spent varying periods alone in the frozen forest in an unsuccessful hunt for food. The initial symptoms are feelings of morbid depression, nausea, and distaste for most ordinary foods, and sometimes periods of semi-stupor. Gradually, the victim becomes obsessed with paranoid ideas of being bewitched and is subject to homicidal, and occasionally suicidal, thoughts. He feels that he is possessed by the Wetiko monster, a fierce cannibalistic being, to whose will he has become subjected. The conviction of the existence of a Wetiko monster itself is not evidence of pathology, since this is a socially shared belief among the Ojibwe. If the illness progresses beyond this stage, the individual begins to see those around him, often close family members, as fat, luscious animals which he desires to devour. Finally, the Wetiko sufferer enters a stage of violent homicidal cannibalism. It is commonly thought that once this stage is reached and the person has tasted human flesh, the craving will not leave him and he must be killed. 15.5 Short summary of the story Cannibal Woman. The lady is given otter to eat by her husband, who does not know that she is allergic to it. It would either kill her or make her into a Wendigo, a cannibal, and they will start feeding on human flesh. The woman becomes a cannibal and eats her husband and all the people who comes directly in her path. Cannibals will not kill people who are on the side of them. The woman kills whole tribes but does not attack her daughter, Go-Tish-Schwash. 70. Go-Tish-Schwash is disgusted with her mother's cannibalistic behavior and with the help of the people kills her by cutting off her head. Her mother becomes a spirit and guides her to go away to the south before she also turned into a cannibal. Go-Tish-Schwash succeeds in going away to the south without killing anyone. She is greeted there by the spirits who turn her into a Mi-Sabe, which is a non-meat eater. 15.6 Summary. After reading this lesson you learnt the position held by Ron Geyshick among the galaxy of writers. You also understood why his works are so popular. You also understood what is the universal appeal the writer holds over the readers. 15.7 Check your progress. 1. What was the cannibal woman allergic to? 2. According to the story, how does one turn into a cannibal? 3. Who was Go-Tish-Schwash and what did she plan to do? 4. Did Go-Tish-Schwash's mother want her to become a cannibal? 5. What happens to Go-Tish-Schwash at the end of the story? 6. Narrate the story of the cannibal woman. Reference: https://www.librarything.com/author/Geyshickren. 71. Lesson 16. In Search of April Raintree, Beatrice Mosonior Culleton. Learning outcome. After reading this lesson you will understand. What is the meaning of autoethnography? Position of Beatrice Culleton in the field of Canadian literature. Impact of racism on the characters. Family bonds among Aboriginals. Structure. 16.1 Introduction. 16.2 About the author. 16.3 About the work. 16.4 Short summary of the novel. 16.5 Racism and its impact. 16.6 Summary. 16.7 Check your progress. 16.1 Introduction. Autoethnography is a form of qualitative research in which an author uses self-reflection and writing to explore anecdotal and personal experience and connect this autobiographical story to wider cultural, political, and social meanings and understandings. The novel, In Search of April Raintree, is a good example of this kind of writing. 72. 16.2 About the author. Beatrice Culleton is one of the eminent writers in Canadian literature. She was born and brought up in the Métis culture. Her foster care placements were with white families. Her novel In Search of April Raintree remains one of the most popular books of Aboriginal literature. 16.3 About the work. This novel portrays about a young Métis woman trying to survive in two worlds. Some Aboriginals try to escape from negative images by using alcohol or by denying their ancestry, and others are bogged down in internalized racism. In colonial Canada, Aboriginal people have dealt with and continue to deal with Euro-Canadian dominance, cultural control and racism, all of which April and Cheryl suffer. Beatrice Culleton's fictional autobiography In Search of April Raintree analyzes April and Cheryl Raintree's emotional and psychological responses to oppression and racism towards freedom and love. The sisters suffer internalized racism, self-hatred and self-alienation and are acculturated to white cultural standards after experiencing racism. Mogenier's novel, In Search of April Raintree, was published in 1983. The story of April and Cheryl Raintree, two Métis sisters growing up in foster homes in Manitoba, Canada, and chronicling their lives from childhood into adulthood, was based on the traumatic experiences from Mogenier's own life, including sexual violence, the suicide of two of her sisters, and the search for her Métis identity. 16.4 Short summary of the novel. Due to their parents' alcohol abuse, Cheryl and April Raintree, two Métis sisters growing up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, are separated from each other and their family. Life in a variety of foster homes is typified by neglect, ill treatment, and shame at their native heritage. Throughout much of the narrative, Cheryl maintains pride in her ancestry, but early on, April decides to deny her native self as much as is possible. Over the years, distance develops between the two sisters. April's marriage to a wealthy white man offers a glamorous life in Toronto and financial comfort but emotional impoverishment. Divorcing her husband brings April temporary freedom and the opportunity to repair the breach which has developed between her and Cheryl. But Cheryl's pride has failed to sustain her. Now a prostitute and alcoholic, she is not the sister April remembered. And, in a central and horrific accident of mistaken identity, April is confused with Cheryl and is brutally raped by a gang of young 73 white men. She survives, but Cheryl does not, and the book ends with April's commitment to raise Cheryl's son with the pride and stability her sister could not provide. April's search for self is over, and her life begins anew. Beatrice Mogenier's novel, In Search of April Raintree, 1983, emphasizes the power of bonds between Native women. Especially important are familial bonds, such as sisterhood, in the world of foster homes and residential schools that try to isolate Native family members from their own cultures and each other. The internalized racism that develops throughout April's childhood and adolescence contributes to her sense of alienation from her Métis heritage and her own sister, whom she perceives as being too Métis, both in terms of her appearance and beliefs. While April spends her whole life trying to distance herself from her sister and her Métis culture, Cheryl's suicide allows April to develop a more intimate understanding of her sister's life. April's search for her identity is incomplete without her posthumous reconciliation with Cheryl, Gillis 68. Thus, when Cheryl dies and April discovers her letters and son, their bond strengthens, and April becomes ready to accept her Métis heritage. Only through Cheryl's death can April finally begin her personal growth, self-actualization, and psychological healing from the trauma in her life. Throughout her life, April deals with racism on a multitude of levels that can be primarily classified into two intertwining categories, personal and institutional. The violence and abuse, both childhood and sexual, that April faces from the Desrosiers and her rapists, respectively, are examples of personal racism. This includes the slanderous names that the Desrosiers call her, like, half-breed, squaw, and, ape, the bitch. While the word, half-breed, is used as a synonym for sloth, squalor, and disobedience, the term, ape, the bitch, implies a primordial savagery and animal sexuality, which dehumanizes April. The foster care process works to distance April from her Métis traditions as well as her family. April also experiences racism in the form of physical and verbal abuse and her rapists, in the added form of sexual violence. When April gets raped, she is forced into the identity of the squaw, a figure created to justify sexual and racial abuse. Thus, external identities are imposed upon April to dehumanize and limit her. Ultimately, both the Desrosiers and the rapists use their personal racism to justify mistreating April because they perceive her race as inferior. The sisters have marked differences in their outlooks. Differences which lead to intense conflict and finally a rift that is healed only with Cheryl's death. When Cheryl dies, April can no longer evade the social conditions that lead to the native girl syndrome and takes on Cheryl's unfulfilled responsibility to fight for Métis rights. 74. 16.5 Racism and its impact. The most powerful form of racism that derives both from the personal and institutional places is self-hatred. As April encounters external racism throughout her childhood and adolescence, she internalizes it and develops a shame for her Métis heritage. When April and Cheryl first become isolated from each other when they are put into separate foster homes, her Métis sister remains the most important person in April's life. She lives for her visiting days with Cheryl. At first, April has unconditional love for her parents and misses her family's togetherness, but this perception deteriorates quickly. At this point, April still tries to grasp onto the familial and cultural bonds that have been ripped away from her by the social workers. When she begins to develop resentment towards her parents for no longer visiting them, April comforts Cheryl with, "No matter what, we'll always have each other," and decides, "To hell with my parents. To hell with everyone, except Cheryl." April's racist upbringing shifts her perception of her Métis culture and family and fills her with anger towards her parents. April also starts distancing herself from Cheryl in attempt to blend into white society since she believes that her sister represents her suppressed Métis self. Once April and Cheryl are taken away from their parents, who are alcoholics and deemed by social workers to be unsuitable for raising their own children, April begins to distance herself from her Métis family and heritage. When April describes her grade 10 life at St. Bernadette's Academy, she states, "I credited my ability to make friends easily to the fact that none of them knew I was part Indian. I came up with an outright lie, an excuse for being with Children's Aid. I told my friends that my parents had died in a plane crash." April uses her light skin to obscure the fact that she is Métis and the real reason for being with Children's Aid. Thus, April's family and heritage become parts of her that she wants to repress to be accepted in white society. April also decides to marry Bob Radcliffe to further assimilate herself into the white world. Although Cheryl advises against it, April marries him and is ecstatic that she wouldn't have to worry about changing the spelling of her name, because it was now legally April Radcliffe. When Cheryl apologizes to April at the airport for disapproving of her marriage before April leaves to Toronto with Bob, April finally admits to her sister, "I can't accept being a Métis. That's the hardest thing I've ever said to you, Cheryl. And I'm glad that you don't feel the same way I do. Being a Métis means I'm one of the have-nots. I want what white society can give me. I'm different from you. You have to do what you believe is right for you, but I have to go my way. I'll always be there if you need me." For the first time, April admits to Cheryl that she is ashamed of her Métis background and tries to distance herself from her sister. April emphasizes the differences between herself and Cheryl with their outlook on their background, using phrases like, "You don't feel the same I do, I'm different from you," and, "I have to go my way." Nevertheless, Cheryl's visit to Toronto exposes 75. April's Métis heritage and results in her stepmother's successful attempt to end the marriage. In addition, April's promise, "I'll always be there if you need me," is empty because her quest for whiteness causes her to leave Cheryl in a pivotal point of her sister's life. While April tries to fit into white society in Toronto, Cheryl becomes the embodiment of the native girl syndrome when she becomes disillusioned upon finding her father and discovering her mother's suicide and drops out of school, enters an abuse relationship, takes up alcoholism, and becomes a prostitute. Even though Cheryl's life is sacrificed in the process, her death helps April find herself. While April spent her entire life trying to alienate herself from her Métis heritage and family, Cheryl's death was the final push towards April's acceptance of her full identity, which now encompasses her deceased sister. Once Cheryl dies, April is finally able to reconnect with her sister. Cheryl's suicide letter says, "April, you have strength. Dream my dreams for me. Make them come true for me." Cheryl's death imbues April with a sense of responsibility to fulfill her sister's dreams. Only when Cheryl dies does April ultimately find her sister's presence within herself, and from then on, Cheryl lives through April. 16.6 Summary. From this lesson you understood what is the meaning of autoethnography. You understood what is the position of Beatrice Culleton in the field of Canadian literature. You also understood the impact of racism on the natives. You also understood the importance of family bonds among Aboriginals. 16.7 Check your progress. 1. Comment on the effects of alcoholism on the lives of the main characters. 2. Does April accept her Métis background? 3. Yeah, but the Indian blood runs through your veins, April. To deny that, you deny a basic part of yourself. You'll never be satisfied until you can accept that fact. Do you agree with this statement of Cheryl? 4. Narrate briefly the story of April and Cheryl. 5. How suitable is the title In Search of April Raintree? References. https://www.jenny.com/people/beatrice-fullerton/6000000077180241889 http://www.literature-study-online.com/essays/beatrice-mogenier.html 76. Model Question Paper BA English. 3rd year, 6th semester Core Paper 13. Post-colonial Literature 2 Canadian Literature. Time. 3 hours. Marks. 75. Section A 10 times 2 equals 20 marks. Answer any 10. 1. Explain the line Where are the tribes, the feathered bestiaries? 2. What are the differences between the woman and the English settlers in The Cattle Thief? 3. What is a parable? 4. What does Godzilla symbolize? 5. Write a brief note on Peter Wallander. 6. What does Krotesch mean by namelessness? 7. Why does Ainsley want to have a child? 8. Write a note on Jamie Paul. 9. How does the narrator suffer because of the birthmark on his face? 10. Write a note on Josh Smith. 11. What was the cannibal woman allergic to? 12. Does April accept her Métis background? 77. Section B 5 times 5 equals 25 marks. Answer any 5 in 200 words. 13. What was the feeling of the poet when she first came to Canada? 14. Comment on the loss of culture of immigrants to Canada. 15. How does Klein identify his own plight with another important instance of ethnic persecution? 16. Why did Jamie and Rita Jo move to the big city? 17. How is like an old proud king in a parable a metaphysical poem? 18. Comment on the theme, Search for Oneself, in the novel The Edible Woman. 19. Narrate the story of the cannibal woman. Section C 3 times 10 equals 30 marks. Answer any 3 essays in 300 words. 20. What are the main issues dealt with in the poem Indian Reservation, Caughnawaga? 21. Disunity, Krotesch suggests, is in fact Canada's unity comment. 22. Are the white characters aware of their own prejudice? Do they justify thinking the way that they do? 23. Write an essay on Mariposa as a microcosm of early life in Canada. 24. How suitable is the title In Search of April Raintree?